This video is sponsored by Gale Healthy, which offers various healthy products such as ergonomic anti-back disease chairs, back massagers, etc. Link is in comments and description. The Anunnaki, those who from heaven came to earth. A complete history of humanity's most ancient gods, from the clay tablets of Sumer to the foundations of Western civilization. Entirely based on archaeological and cuneiform scholarship, drawing on 40,000 tablets from Nippur, Ur, Eridu, Nineveh, Lagash, and Uruk. Before there were gods, there was the deep. The Sumerians called it the Abzu, the primordial ocean beneath all things, pressing up through the roots of mountains, seeping into the dark crevices where light had never gone. It was not a place, it was a condition. The universe's first memory of itself, wet, dark, and alive with potential. They knew this because their fathers' fathers had been told by beings who claimed to remember. This is not a story about ancient astronauts. It is not a story about lizard people, genetic experiments, or gold mining operations on a distant planet. Those stories have been told so many times that the words have worn smooth as river stones, and they have obscured something far stranger, far more unsettling, and far more real. This is the story of what the ancient Mesopotamians actually believed, and why, once you understand the full architecture of that belief, you may find it harder to dismiss than any science fiction scenario ever invented. The Anunnaki were not aliens. They were something worse. They were the universe looking at itself and deciding it had feelings about what it saw. What follows is reconstructed from the clay, from 40,000 cuneiform tablets excavated from the ruins of Nippur, Ur, Lagash, Eridu, and Nineveh, from the work of scholars who spent decades learning a dead language so they could read the oldest stories ever written, from the theological debates of priests who argued for centuries about the nature of divine will, and from the gaps, the deliberate silences, the broken tablets, the stories that were never written down because some things were considered too dangerous to commit to clay. The Sumerians believed the universe had a memory. They believed that memory could be offended, and they believed that 7 beings of incomprehensible power had once walked among humanity, and that their departure had left a wound in the world that had never fully healed. They may have been right about more than we are comfortable admitting. Begin at the beginning. Begin in the dark. Part 1. The Descent. Chapter 1. The 7 Judges of the Underworld. The oldest name in Sumerian literature is not a human name. It is not the name of a king, a warrior, or a poet. It is the name of a city, and the city's name is Eridu. Eridu sits at the edge of what was once the Persian Gulf's ancient shoreline in the marsh country of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers came apart into 1,000 finger-like channels, and the land was neither quite water nor quite earth. Today it is a mound of archaeological debris in the desert, a tell, the layered accumulation of millennia of human habitation compressed into a geological feature. But when Sumerians drew their maps, when they composed their king lists, when they traced the genealogy of civilization itself, they always began at Eridu. After kingship had descended from heaven, the Sumerian king list begins, kingship was first in Eridu. Descended from heaven. The phrase is crucial. The Sumerians did not believe civilization had grown organically from human ingenuity. They believed it had been given, lowered, handed down from above like a tool being passed to someone who has demonstrated they are finally ready to use it. The word they used for this act of transference was me, pronounced roughly may, a concept so fundamental to Sumerian theology that it resists a clean translation into English. The ME were the divine ordinances, the master plans for civilization. They were not commandments or laws in the biblical sense. They were more like the source codes that made civilization run. The ME included kingship, descent to the underworld, the art of music, the craft of the scribe, the descent of the gods to earth, the ascent of the gods from earth, the art of the hero, the art of power, the art of treachery, the descent of the righteous, the art of the carpenter, the art of the smith, the art of the tanner, the art of the builder, the art of the basket weaver, the art of wisdom, the art of lamentation. The last one is worth pausing on. The Sumerians believed that the ability to mourn was a divine gift, that grief, structured, ritualized grief, was part of what made civilization possible. They did not separate the sacred from the sorrowing. The ME were held, according to the oldest texts, by the god Enki. Enki is the one they rarely mention in the popular theories. He doesn't fit the template. He is not a warrior king from the stars come to enslave humanity. He is something more complicated, and therefore more interesting. He is the god of wisdom, of fresh water, of magic, of creation, of mischief, of compassion. He lives in the Abzu, the primordial deep beneath the city of Eridu. He is the one who, in the flood myth, warns the one human he favors, variously named Zuisudra, Atrahasis, or later Utnapishtim, that the other gods have decided to destroy humanity. Enki is not supposed to do this. The decision was made in the divine assembly, and the gods were sworn to secrecy. But Enki finds a loophole. He does not tell the human directly. He speaks to a wall. He whispers the warning to the reed hut where his favorite man is sleeping, and the man happens to overhear. Technically, the oath is unbroken. The Sumerians found this charming. It tells you something about how they thought about divine power, that even the most powerful beings were constrained by the rules of their own nature, and that wisdom sometimes expressed itself as cleverness rather than might. But Enki is also the one who created the first humans, and the creation story he features in is far stranger than the sanitized versions usually cited. In the beginning, the text says, the gods were tired. This is the opening premise of the Atarahis epic, one of the oldest complete narratives in human literature, written in Akkadian, the Semitic language that absorbed and translated much of the earlier Sumerian tradition, sometime around 1700 BCE, though drawing on Sumerian sources centuries older. The gods had to do all the work themselves. The lesser gods, the Igigi, were the ones assigned to dig the great canals, to dredge the riverbeds, to build the mountains and level the earth. They worked for 40 years in divine time, which is not human time, and they grew exhausted and resentful. One night they burned their tools. They marched to the gate of the great god Enlil's house and refused to work. Enlil, who controlled the wind and the storm and the authority of heaven, was woken from his sleep. He was frightened. The text says so explicitly. The king of heaven heard the noise of the revolt and was afraid. He called an emergency assembly of the great gods, On, heaven itself, Enki, wisdom and water, and the mother goddess Ninhursag, sometimes called Mami, the birth goddess. Together, they had to solve the problem. The Igigi would not work, but the work had to be done. Enki had a solution. He always had a solution. I will make a creature, he said. It will bear the burden. The creature was called Lalu, the primitive worker. It would be made of clay, mixed with the blood of a slaughtered god. Not a great god, a minor one. A god named Wielu, whose name may mean we have a god, was killed for this purpose. His intelligence, His divine spirit was mixed into the clay from which the first humans were shaped. Ninhursag, the birth goddess, modeled 14 figures in clay, 7 male, 7 female. She placed them in the womb of the universe. After 9 months, they were born. The gods celebrated. They tasted the new beings. They approved. And then they put humanity to work. This is not a metaphor the Sumerians were making. They were completely serious. Human beings were made to do the work the lesser gods refused to do. Temple labor, canal digging, agricultural work, the endless maintenance of civilized infrastructure. All of this was in Sumerian theology the literal purpose for which humans had been created. And the gods in the Sumerian model needed this. They needed the food that agriculture produced, the temples that human hands built, the worship that gave them sustenance. The relationship was contractual, almost commercial. Humans produced, gods consumed. In exchange, gods provided rain, fertility, protection from chaos, the organized structure of civilization. It was not a relationship of love. It was a relationship of mutual dependency. This is the context that mainstream popular culture misses when it discusses the Anunnaki. It reaches for the spectacular, the spacecraft, the genetic labs, the mining colonies, and misses what the ancient texts are actually saying, which is darker and stranger and more philosophically challenging, that the Sumerians understood themselves as service workers for beings of incomprehensible power, and that they had made a theology that justified this relationship, and that within that theology they had hidden, like Enki whispering to the wall, the seeds of a completely different story. The Anunnaki, literally those of royal blood, or those who came from heaven to earth, or in some readings, those of On come to earth, were the great gods, the judges, the decision-makers of the divine assembly. In early Sumerian texts, there are 7 of them, though the number later expanded to 50, then to hundreds. 7 great judges who lived in the underworld, not heaven, the underworld. This is the detail that changes everything. And the gods in the Sumerian model needed this. They needed the food that agriculture produced, the temples that human hands built, the worship that gave them sustenance. The relationship was contractual, almost commercial. Humans produced, gods consumed. In exchange, gods provided rain, fertility, protection from chaos, the organized structure of civilization. It was not a relationship of love. It was a relationship of mutual dependency. This is the context that mainstream popular culture misses when it discusses the Anunnaki. It reaches for the spectacular, the spacecraft, the genetic labs, the mining colonies, and misses what the ancient texts are actually saying, which is darker and stranger and more philosophically challenging, that the Sumerians understood themselves as service workers for beings of incomprehensible power, and that they had made a theology that justified this relationship, and that within that theology they had hidden, like Enki whispering to the wall, the seeds of a completely different story. The Anunnaki, literally those of royal blood, or those who came from heaven to earth, or in some readings, those of On come to earth, were the great gods, the judges, the decision-makers of the divine assembly. In early Sumerian texts, there are 7 of them, though the number later expanded to 50, then to hundreds. 7 great judges who lived in the underworld, not heaven, the underworld. This is the detail that changes everything. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Heaven and Earth. The Sumerian universe was not organized the way we organize ours. We think of space as infinite and direction as relative. Up and down are just orientations that depend on where you're standing. The Sumerians thought of the universe as a building with a very specific floor plan, and that floor plan had moral and spiritual implications that shaped everything they believed about the gods. At the top, An, heaven itself, the sky. But An was not just a location. An was a god, the oldest of the great gods, the source of divine authority, the word from which all other divine names derived. The sky was not a backdrop for the god's activities. It was itself a being, though a being so vast and so remote that it had, by the historical period, become largely inactive. An sat in heaven and issued decrees that he seemed to carry out by the simple act of existence. In the middle, Ki, earth. But Ki was also a goddess, the earth itself, originally paired with An in a primordial union. An, heaven, and Ki, earth, had once been joined, and their separation was the act that created the universe. Their son was Enlil, the wind and storm, who filled the space between them. Enlil pushed heaven and earth apart, and in the gap between them, the world as we know it could exist. Below, the Kur, the underworld, the mountain of the dead, the place beneath the earth, the realm of no return. And beneath even the Kur, the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean that the Sumerians believed underlay the entire earth, the source of rivers, springs, and wells, the reservoir of all wisdom and magical power. This was Enki's domain. In this cosmological architecture, the gods were not beings who lived apart from the universe. They were the universe's internal structure. They were what held things in place. The implications for the Anunnaki are profound. When the texts say the Anunnaki descended to Earth and later returned to the underworld, they are not describing spaceship journeys. They are describing something that happens inside the structure of reality itself. The descent of the gods is a movement within the cosmos, not a visitation from outside it. But what does that mean? The Sumerians thought carefully about the relationship between the seen and the unseen, the living and the dead, the divine and the mortal, and they mapped that relationship onto their physical landscape with extraordinary precision. The city of Nippur, the religious center of ancient Sumer, was built around a temple called the Akur, the House of the Mountain. Inside the Akur was a sacred space called the Dur Anki, the bond of heaven and earth. This was not a metaphor. The Sumerians believed that the Akur was the actual physical point where heaven and earth were connected, where the bond that kept the cosmos from flying apart was maintained. The priests who served there were not simply performing religious rituals, they were performing cosmological maintenance. Without the Akur, heaven and earth might drift apart. Without the priests, the Akur might fail. Without the rituals, the priests could not do their work. The entire civilization was structured as a machine for keeping the universe in one piece, and the Anunnaki were the engineers. In the descent of Inanna, the most complete mythological narrative from ancient Sumer, and one of the strangest, most disturbing texts ever written, the great goddess Inanna decides to descend to the underworld, to the realm of her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. The text does not explain why. The most common scholarly interpretation is that Inanna wants to expand her power to conquer death itself. But the text is more ambiguous than that. It says only that Inanna set her ear toward the great below. She heard something. She was drawn. Before she leaves, she gives careful instructions to her servant Ninshubur. If she does not return in 3 days, go to the gods and beg for her release. Inanna descends through 7 gates. At each gate, she must remove one of her divine attributes, her crown, her earrings, her necklace, her breastplate, her golden ring, her lapis lazuli measuring rod and measuring line, and finally her royal garments. She arrives in the underworld naked and bows low. The 7 judges of the underworld, the Anunnaki, look at her, and they strike her dead. The text says this plainly. The 7 judges of the underworld, the Anunnaki, pronounce judgment upon her. They killed the Queen of Heaven. They looked at her, and she died. This is a moment of profound theological disruption. Inanna is not a minor goddess. She is the goddess of love and war, of beauty and power, the Venus of the ancient world, one of the most important figures in the Sumerian pantheon. She is killed by a group of beings who are referred to not as monsters or enemies, but as judges. They are following a procedure. Her death is not a murder, it is a sentence. Her corpse hangs on a hook in the underworld for 3 days. Nothing lives, nothing grows. All fertility leaves the world above. Then Enki intervenes. He creates 2 small beings from the dirt under his fingernails and sends them into the underworld to mourn with Ereshkigal, who is described as being in agony herself, suffering as if in childbirth, crying out in pain. The small beings mirror her sorrow, validating it, accompanying it, and Ereshkigal, in gratitude, offers them a gift. They ask for Inanna's corpse. Ereshkigal gives it. They sprinkle it with the food of life and the water of life. Inanna is restored. But she cannot leave without a substitute. The law of the underworld, not a divine rule but a cosmic law, a structural necessity, requires that when a being leaves the realm of the dead, someone must take their place. The Anunnaki enforce this not because they wish to, but because the architecture of the universe demands it. This is what makes the Anunnaki different from any popular conception of alien overlords or cosmic administrators. They are not making the rules. They are the rules, the personification of the inexorable structure of reality. And Inanna, when she returns to the world above, turns to look at her husband Dumuzi, who has been sitting on her throne instead of mourning for her, and she gives him to the underworld demons to serve as her substitute. The text does not moralize about this. It presents it as the natural consequence of the situation. Inanna was judged. She returned from judgment. Someone had to descend in her place. Dumuzi should have been mourning. He wasn't. He was sitting on the throne of heaven, comfortable. The Anunnaki's judgment is not evil. It is the cosmos's insistence on balance. This is the beating heart of the Anunnaki mythology that is almost never discussed in popular culture. The Anunnaki are, fundamentally, the gods of justice at the deepest possible level. Not human justice, which is contingent and sometimes corrupt, but the structural justice of reality itself. The iron law that every action has a consequence, that every descent requires a corresponding ascent, that nothing is ever truly free. You don't get to walk back from the underworld without paying. The implications of this for the Sumerian understanding of civilization are extraordinary. If the gods who judge reality are the gods of the underworld, if death is not an aberration, but the place where final verdicts are rendered, then every human life is already a kind of trial. Every king who claimed to rule by divine authority was actually claiming to embody the judgment of beings who lived beneath the earth, not above it, beneath it. The dead ruled the living. The past judged the present. And the instruments of that judgment were 7 beings whose names were so powerful that to write them in a text was itself a form of magic. Chapter 3. The Names That Cannot Be Spoken. The 7 Anunnaki of the underworld are not consistently named across all Sumerian texts. This inconsistency is itself meaningful. In Mesopotamian theology, a name was not a label, it was a description of essence. To know the true name of a being was to know its fundamental nature, and to possess that knowledge was a form of power over the being named. The gods did not hand out their names carelessly. Sacred names were often deliberately obscured, hidden in theological riddles, or spoken only in specific ritual contexts by priests who had undergone years of preparation. The reluctance to name the 7 underworld judges is therefore not a scholarly accident, not just missing tablets or incomplete records. It was theological policy. The judges of the final underworld were beings whose names were too powerful to use casually, too dangerous to commit to clay outside of the most controlled ritual settings. What we do have are their functions. The first among the Anunnaki judges in the underworld tradition is Nergal, the god of the midday sun in its most destructive aspect, the plague bringer, the one who held the tablets of fate. Nergal was also, in a strange and revealing mythological tradition, originally not a god of the underworld at all. He was a sky god who descended and stayed. His myth is one of the great love stories of antiquity, and it contains a theological argument that would not look out of place in the most sophisticated modern philosophy. The story begins with an insult. The gods are holding a banquet in heaven. Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, cannot attend. She is bound to her realm and cannot leave. So she sends a messenger to receive her portion of the feast on her behalf. One of the gods in heaven, Nergal, fails to rise when the messenger enters. This is an offense against protocol, against the dignity of the underworld's queen. Ereshkigal demands satisfaction. Nergal must descend to her realm and receive punishment. Nergal descends. He is given careful instructions by Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki. Do not sit on the offered chair. Do not eat the offered bread. Do not drink the offered beer. Do not wash your feet in the offered water. Most importantly, do not sleep with Ereshkigal. Nergal follows the instructions for 6 days. On the 7th day, he sleeps with Ereshkigal. In one version of the story, having done so, he immediately flees back to heaven. Ereshkigal is devastated. She sends a message to Ea, return him, or she will destroy the underworld's containment, will throw open the gates, and the dead will rise and overwhelm the living. Nergal is sent back, and this time, when he arrives in the underworld, he seizes Ereshkigal by the hair, drags her from her throne, and they become co-rulers of the underworld together. This is not a story about dominance. The Babylonian scholars who interpreted this text understood it as a cosmological parable about the necessity of balance. The underworld needed a male principle. The sky had come down to fill a vacancy in the deep. Heaven and earth were married. The bond of heaven and earth, the Duran key at the center of Nippur, had been made complete by this union, this descent, this passionate and violent joining of above and below. The Anunnaki in this reading are not a ruling class. They are the joints of the universe. But there is another set of names, less known and more disturbing. In the ritual texts, the lamentations, the exorcisms, the incantations that Mesopotamian priests used to deal with disease, misfortune, and supernatural attack, the 7 Anunnaki of the underworld appear in a different mode. They are no longer the stately judges watching Inanna die. They are more immediate, more threatening, more personal. They are the 7, just the 7. The 7 appear in incantation texts as the agents of specific kinds of harm. They are storm demons, disease carriers, the beings who attack sleeping children and drive people to madness. They are neither gods nor monsters, but something in between, powers with the authority of divinity, but the behavior of predators. In the great incantation series known as Maklu, which survives in a 12-tablet compilation from the Neo-Assyrian period, the 7 are invoked and then warded against in the same breath. The priest calls their names to acknowledge their power, then burns effigies to break their hold. The ritual happens at night, specifically at the midpoint of the night, when the 7 are said to be at their most active. The Maklu texts describe them thus: they are 7, they are 7. In the depths of the ocean they are 7. In the brilliance of the heavens they are 7. They were born in the depths of the ocean. In the brilliance of the heavens they grew up. 7 and 7, heaven and ocean, born below, grown above. This is not the description of alien invaders or gods from another planet. It is the description of principles that pervade the cosmos, beings who have been present since before the beginning, who belong to both the highest and the lowest registers of reality simultaneously. The Makhluk continues, they are not male, they do not know female, they do not know the relief of water poured for the dead, they do not clean the flour from the offering table, they do not eat food offered to the gods, they do not drink libation of beer, they cannot be removed from the wall, they cannot be appeased by an offering. This is a radical claim. The 7 Anunnaki, in their most dangerous aspect, are beyond the reach of religion. They do not want offerings. They do not want temples. They do not want worship. They cannot be bribed or placated or negotiated with. They simply are. And yet, and this is the crucial detail, they can be named. They can be recognized. And recognition, in Mesopotamian magic, is half the battle. You cannot fight what you cannot see. You cannot protect against what you cannot name. The entire apparatus of Mesopotamian ritual magic was built on the principle that the 7 could be acknowledged, addressed, and thereby not defeated, but navigated around. This is not superstition. This is a highly sophisticated response to the recognition that reality contains forces that cannot be controlled, only understood, and understanding them, holding their nature in the mind, speaking their attributes aloud, performing the rituals that make their existence explicit, was how the Mesopotamian civilization survived in a world that was, by any honest assessment, deeply unpredictable and often catastrophic. Floods that could kill a civilization in a night, droughts that could last a decade, plagues that swept through populations with no comprehensible cause or pattern. The 7 were real. They just weren't flying in from another planet. They were the names the Sumerians gave to catastrophe. And catastrophe is not metaphorical. It kills people. It destroys cities. It erases cultures. The Anunnaki were the faces of the forces that did all of that. And the astonishing achievement of Sumerian theology is that it found a way to live with those faces, to look at them, name them, negotiate with them, and still build cities, write literature, fall in love, raise children, and create something worth preserving. That is not a primitive impulse. That is civilization at its most profound. And we have, in our eagerness to find something simpler, a story about spaceships and gold mining that fits our science fiction expectations, missed the actual miracle. Chapter 4. The Flood and the Survivors. Every civilization that has left written records has a flood story. This fact is often cited as evidence for a global catastrophic event, a real flood, so vast it entered the racial memory of all humanity and became the template for divine retribution myths worldwide. The argument is seductive, but it misunderstands what flood stories actually are. A flood story is not just a story about water. It is a story about the boundary between order and chaos, and what happens when that boundary fails. In the Sumerian theological imagination, civilization was not the natural state of things. Civilization was an imposition on chaos, a human and divine construction built on top of the primordial deep, which was always there, always pressing, always waiting. The Abzu beneath the earth was not static and dormant. It was alive and turbulent and required constant management. The rivers flooded because the gods allowed them to, or because they ordered it, or because human sin had tipped the cosmic balance toward destruction. And the gods themselves were divided about whether to save humanity or let it drown. The Atrahasis epic, the fullest Mesopotamian flood narrative, gives us the Anunnaki in their most politically complex role. The story begins not with the flood, but with overpopulation. Humanity, created to do the work the lesser gods refused, had multiplied beyond what the gods had intended. The earth was full of noise. The gods could not sleep. Enlil, who controlled the decision-making of the divine assembly, tried to reduce the population through plague. Enki warned his favorite human. The plague was averted. Enlil tried drought. Enki warned his human again. The drought was averted. Enlil tried famine. Enki intervened. By this point, the divine assembly was deeply divided. Enki kept sabotaging the population control measures. Enlil wanted a final solution. He proposed the flood. The divine assembly agreed, but secretly. They swore a solemn oath not to warn humanity. Enki took the oath, and then he whispered through the wall. The man Atrahasis built a boat. He loaded it with animals and craftsmen and provisions. The flood came. It lasted 7 days and 7 nights. The flood roared like a bull. The wind howled like a screaming eagle. And the gods suffered. This is the part the popular versions always skip. The gods had not thought through what it would mean to destroy humanity. When the flood was over and Atrahasis burned an offering on the mountain, the gods crowded around it like flies. They were starving. They had destroyed the beings who fed them. Enlil was furious that Atrahasis had survived. He accused Enki of betraying the oath. Enki, characteristically, deflected. I only swore not to reveal the decision. I didn't reveal it. The wall heard it. The argument in the divine assembly that follows is one of the most remarkable passages in ancient literature. Enlil wants to destroy Atrahasis. Enki argues for survival. The mother goddess, Ninhursag, weeps for the people who have drowned. She says, "How could I have ordered the destruction of my own people? I gave birth to them. Now they are filling the sea like fish." The Anunnaki, the 7 great judges, listen to all of this and render their verdict. The verdict is not, humanity is saved. The verdict is more nuanced than that. Human beings are saved, but they are changed. The gods implement limits. Not all humans will live forever. Death is introduced as a formal divine policy. Not all women will give birth successfully. Infant mortality is built into the structure of life. Celibate priestesses will be created who do not reproduce at all. The noise problem will be managed by structured mortality. This is the most theologically sophisticated aspect of the flood myth. The Anunnaki do not simply save humanity or condemn it. They redesign the terms of existence. They impose, permanently, the conditions of human life as we actually experience it. The reality of death, the grief of pregnancy loss, the existence of people who choose not to reproduce. The flood is not a punishment. The flood is the mechanism by which the gods stop pretending that humanity can exist on its original terms. The new humanity is a negotiated humanity. Beings made for service, yes, but now also beings with a structured relationship to their own mortality and to the divine. What survives is not the original creation. What survives is something new. And the one man who survives, Utnapishtim in the Gilgamesh version, does not get to go back to ordinary life. He is taken to the ends of the earth, to the mouth of the rivers, and given eternal life as a consolation prize that is also a kind of exile. He is not a hero who won. He is a discontinuity, a remnant of the old world who does not belong to the new one. When Gilgamesh travels to find him, centuries later in narrative time, Utnapishtim does not greet him as a victor. He tells him plainly, "You wore yourself out with ceaseless toil. What have you gained? When you exhausted yourself with labor, what did you achieve?" The flood survivor's message to the hero seeking immortality is not, "This is how you cheat death." It is, "You can't. And it wouldn't make you happy if you could." The Anunnaki, as the judges of this reality, are the guarantors of that hard truth. They do not offer transcendence. They offer exactness. The universe is as it is. The dead are dead. The living will die. This is not cruelty. It is the structure of things. But there is one more layer to the flood narrative that is almost never discussed. In the Sumerian flood story, the hero is not named Utnapishtim. He is named Zusudra, which translates as he who found life of long days, or the life of distant days. After the flood, Zusudra is taken to the mythological land of Dilmun, a paradise at the edge of the world, and given eternal life. He is described not as a king or a priest or a warrior, but as a servant. He spent his life before the flood, bowing down before the gods, building shrines, sweeping them clean, performing offerings daily. His salvation is not a reward for heroism. It is a reward for service. The Anunnaki saved one human not because he was the best human, but because he had been the most attentive to the divine. He had listened to the gods, cared for their houses, maintained the bond between heaven and earth at the level of daily ritual. He was the living embodiment of the social contract that the Sumerians believed made civilization work. In saving him, the Anunnaki were not choosing a genetic superior to repopulate the earth. They were preserving the practice, the ritual, the daily maintenance of the cosmic bond. The flood destroys everything. The first thing rebuilt is not a house or a farm, it is a temple. This is what the Sumerians found important enough to record, to preserve, to copy century after century on wet clay and fire in kilns, that when everything is gone, when the gods themselves are weeping from hunger and the world is covered in water, what makes the world livable again is the decision to maintain the relationship between the human and the divine, not to worship out of fear, though the Sumerians understood fear perfectly, but to worship out of the recognition that the cosmos requires maintenance, that the bond between heaven and earth is not automatic, that someone has to show up every day and sweep the temple and place the offerings and sing the lamentation. The Anunnaki are the reason that someone shows up. They are the judges of whether the cosmic contract is being honored, and they have not gone anywhere. Part 2. The Great Ones. Chapter 5. Enlil, the god who hated humanity, and why that makes him important. We have misread Enlil. In the popular telling of Mesopotamian mythology, when it is told at all, Enlil is the villain. He is the god who voted for the flood. He is the cold, authoritarian patriarch who wants to destroy humanity because they make too much noise. He is everything wrong with the divine establishment, the oppressive sky father who must be circumvented by the clever, compassionate Enki. This reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that fundamentally misrepresents what the Sumerians actually thought about power, order, and the nature of divine authority. Enlil's full name in Sumerian is a compound, En, Lord, and Lil, wind, air, space between heaven and earth. He is not the god of wind in the meteorological sense. He is the god of the space that wind moves through, the void between heaven and earth that makes the world possible. When the texts say that Enlil separated heaven and earth, they mean this literally. He is the force of separation, the principle that creates the distance necessary for anything to exist in between. Without Enlil, heaven and earth would be pressed together, and there would be no room for mountains, rivers, cities, or people. He is not a tyrant. He is the condition of existence. This reframing matters because it changes how we understand his desire to destroy humanity. When Enlil is troubled by the noise of humanity, the Sumerian word used is rigmu. a word that means not merely noise, but the totality of human activity, speech, work, music, worship, argument, lament, all of it. The world that humans make is called Rigmu, and Enlil, who is the principle of the structured void between heaven and earth, finds this overwhelming. Here is the theological claim embedded in that complaint. Civilization creates more than it destroys. It creates so much speech, so much activity, so much meaning, that it eventually becomes a problem for the very order it was supposed to maintain. The bond between heaven and earth was supposed to be mediated by civilization, but civilization grew beyond the mediation. It became its own thing, loud and uncontrollable, and producing effects that the divine structure had not anticipated. Enlil's desire to destroy humanity is not tyranny. It is the universe's immune response to a successful experiment that has escaped the lab. His character in the ancient texts is more complex than villain. He is described as the one who carries out the decisions of the assembly, who is bound by divine law just as humans are bound by human law. When he wants to destroy humanity, he goes to the assembly. He does not just act unilaterally. The decision is collective, voted on, deliberated, sworn to in a formal oath. Enlil is the principle of legitimate authority, and legitimate authority, as the Sumerians understood, could make catastrophically wrong decisions that were nonetheless formally correct. The flood is not an atrocity. It is a legal judgment. And this is the insight that no alien god theory can accommodate. The Sumerians were not describing a universe run by monsters. They were describing a universe run by a system. And systems can produce outcomes that feel monstrous even when they follow their own internal logic precisely. Enlil is the face of systemic authority. He is what happens when the rules are followed perfectly and the outcome is still a catastrophe. He is what the Sumerians saw when they looked at the structures that governed their own lives, the laws, the hierarchies, the divine mandates, and recognized that those structures had a reality independent of human wishes, that they could produce suffering without being evil, that they could destroy without malice. Enlil is terrifying because he is not a person. He is a principle. And the Sumerians worshipped him anyway. The great temple complex at Nippur, the Ekur, was his. He was called the Father of Gods, the King of the Gods, the Great Mountain, the Wild Bull. He was praised in hymns of extraordinary beauty. He was given the finest offerings, the most elaborate ritual, because you worship what you depend on, and you depend on the principle of order even when, especially when, that principle is terrible. The Sumerian king Lipit Ishtar wrote a hymn to Enlil in which he prays, "Enlil, when you gaze upon the sleeping land, when you cast your eyes upon the slumbering people, you waken prosperity for the land, you revive the people." In the same hymn, Enlil, whose word is an unalterable decree of heaven. The God whose word is unalterable, whose decrees cannot be questioned, who is the principle of legitimate authority, this is who the king prays to. Not the clever Enki, not the passionate Inanna, the unmovable, inevitable, system-embodying Enlil. Because kings know, better than anyone, that what keeps a city from chaos is not cleverness or love. It is the simple, brutal, unyielding weight of the rule. There is one more aspect of Enlil's character that the popular tradition has almost completely missed, and it is perhaps the most interesting. Enlil had a wife, Ninlil, and the story of how he married her is, by any modern standard, a sexual assault. The texts are explicit. Ninlil was a young woman who had been warned by her mother not to bathe in the river. Enlil saw her, desired her, and forced himself on her in the river. For this, the gods banished him from Nippur. He was made to descend to the underworld, to the realm of the dead. But Ninlil followed him. She was pregnant with his child. What follows is a labyrinthine negotiation in which Enlil, in disguise, sleeps with Ninlil 3 more times, each time in the guise of a different underworld figure, in order to produce 3 underworld deities who will serve as substitutes for the moon god Nanna, the son she was already carrying, so that Nanna can ascend to heaven while the substitutes remain below. The story is disturbing. Modern readers flinch from it, understandably. But what makes it theologically important is what it says about the Sumerian understanding of power. Even the greatest god, the principle of divine authority itself, is subject to justice. Enlil was punished for what he did to Ninlil. He was banished. The gods did not excuse him because of his power or his importance. He had to pay, and Ninlil chose to follow him, not because she forgave him immediately, not because the assault was minimized, but because the bond that had been created, the child she carried, was a divine bond that drew her forward. The Sumerians were not excusing Enlil. They were describing a situation of profound moral complexity in which multiple things are simultaneously true. The assault was real and wrong. The punishment was real and just. And the bond created was also real and had its own gravity. The Anunnaki who judged Enlil were not naive. They punished the greatest god in the pantheon, and they did not pretend that the punishment resolved everything. This is the kind of moral sophistication that modern readers expect from contemporary literature and do not expect from 4,000-year-old clay tablets. And yet, there it is. Chapter 6. Enki's Library, the Tablets Beneath the World. Beneath the city of Eridu, in the first city of civilization, there is a library. Not a physical library, not clay tablets stacked in a room, something more fundamental. The Abzu, Enki's domain, is described in the texts as the place where all knowledge is stored. The Me, those divine ordinances that make civilization possible, are kept there. The tablets of fate that determine the destiny of all beings are stored there. The wisdom of the universe, accumulated since before creation, is in the keeping of the God of the deep. This is a remarkable cosmological claim. The Sumerians place knowledge not in heaven, where the sky god On dwells, or on earth, where human civilization exists, but underground, in the dark, in the deep. Knowledge belongs to what is hidden. Enki's Abzu is not a metaphor for the unconscious in the Jungian sense, though the resonance is striking. It is a specific cosmological location with specific properties. It is the source of the freshwater springs that water the earth. It is the place where magic operates. It is the realm in which the deepest truths about the universe are accessible. It is the domain of the God who is repeatedly described as the wisest of all divine beings, not the most powerful, that is Enlil, not the most authoritative, that is An, but the wisest. The Sumerian word for wisdom is Nimgiru, the one who knows the deep. To be wise is to have access to what is beneath the surface, and the God who has the deepest access to what is beneath the surface is the God who lives there. Enki's mythology is saturated with this theme, the value of what is hidden, the importance of indirect approaches, the wisdom of the detour. He never confronts Enlil directly. He never argues that the flood is wrong in the assembly, or if he does, he loses. He works sideways, through walls, through whispers, through the technically correct loophole. His method is not heroic, it is serpentine. And in the most literal sense, he is associated with serpents. His emblem is 2 entwined serpents. His temple at Eridu was called the Abzu, the House of the Deep, and its symbol was the caduceus-like image of serpents entwined around a staff. This is not coincidence, and it is not a connection to the biblical serpent in Eden, or at least not in the direction that is usually argued. The Sumerian tradition predates the biblical text. The association of deep wisdom with serpents, with beings that live below the surface of the earth, that shed their skin and are transformed, that move through the world in ways that humans find uncanny, is a very ancient one, found across cultures with no direct connection to each other. It points not to an alien origin, but to something in the structure of the human imagination, the sense that the deepest truth hides in the lowest place. Enki's most important act of creation, however, is not humanity itself. It is the act of teaching. After the flood, the world has to be rebuilt. The ME were scattered by the catastrophe. Civilization has to be reinstated from scratch. In the great Sumerian text known as Enki and the World Order, Enki travels to each region of the known world and assigns it its particular divine custodian, the god of grain, the goddess of the sea, the god of cattle, the goddess of weaving. He is the one who organizes the world's diversity, who assigns each thing its particular nature and its particular divine stewardship. But the most poignant moment in this text comes when Inanna approaches him. She has noticed that all the important things have been assigned to other gods. She is left with war and love. Important, yes, but she wants more. She wants the grain. She wants the craft of weaving. She wants the underworld. Enki's response is not dismissive. He takes her seriously. He explains, point by point, why her portfolio is already vast and essential. He does not give her what she asks for. He would be doing the world a disservice if he put her in charge of the grain when grain already has a dedicated deity. But he honors her ambition by explaining why what she already has is irreplaceable. This is Enki at his most human, not all-powerful, not dismissive of the desires of others, but constrained by the reality of the situation, bound by the structure he himself created, doing his best to acknowledge legitimate grievance while explaining why the answer is no. The God of wisdom, in Sumerian theology, cannot give everyone everything they want. He cannot even give himself everything he wants. He is bound by the structure of the universe, just as everyone else is. What makes him wise is that he understands the structure better than anyone else, can navigate it more creatively than anyone else, can find the loopholes and the side passages where others see only walls. But there are walls he cannot get through. One of the most important of these is the wall between the living and the dead. Enki can send beings into the underworld. He can provide the means by which Inanna is restored to life. But he cannot go there himself and bring back the dead by main force. The Anunnaki of the underworld would not permit it, and even Enki's wisdom cannot overcome that judgment. This limitation is crucial. It establishes that even the God who holds all the ME, who keeps the library of universal knowledge, who designed the structure of civilization, is subject to the deepest law of reality. The dead do not return. Not because the gods are cruel, but because the structure of time requires it. If the dead returned, what would death mean? If judgment could be appealed indefinitely, what would judgment be? The underworld's finality is not malice. It is the thing that makes all other things possible. The tablets of destiny that Enki bards in the Abtsu are, in a sense, the operating system of reality. They specify what is and what cannot be, and among the things that cannot be is the reversal of death. Enki knows this, he accepts it, he works within it. And this is perhaps the deepest teaching of the Anunnaki mythology, that wisdom is not the power to break the rules of reality, it is the capacity to work brilliantly within them. There is a text, less well known than the Descent of Inanna or the Atrahasis epic, but extraordinarily interesting, called Enki and Ninhursag. In it, Enki and the great mother goddess Ninhursag are together in Dilmun, the paradise at the edge of the world. Enki repeatedly impregnates Ninhursag, and she repeatedly produces daughters, and Enki sleeps with each daughter, and then their daughters, in a chain of incestuous creation that produces the various plants of the world. Eventually, Ninhursag curses him. He falls ill. 8 parts of his body begin to die. None of the gods can help him. The fox brings Ninhursag back to him. She heals each of his ailments by creating a new deity to inhabit each failing organ. The god created to heal his rib is named Ninti, she who makes live, or Lady of the Rib. The Sumerian word Ti means both rib and life. Ninti means both Lady of the Rib and Lady of Life. This wordplay is central to the text. It has been argued since the early days of archaeology that the story of Eve's creation from Adam's rib in Genesis is derived from this Sumerian text, that the Hebrew tradition has taken the wordplay rib equals life and made it literal, creating a narrative from what was originally a theological pun. The Lady of the Rib became the first woman made from a rib. If this is true, and most scholars find it compelling, then the most famous origin story in Western civilization is a pun. A 4,000-year-old Sumerian pun about the god of wisdom and his complicated relationship with the goddess of creation. The Anunnaki gave us, in this reading, not just the flood and the judgment and the division of the world, but the story that billions of people would tell about where human beings come from. Filtered through translation after translation, stripped of its original context, transplanted into an entirely different theological system, but still, at its root, bearing the fingerprint of Enki and Ninhursag playing complicated games in the paradise at the edge of the world. Chapter 7. Inanna and the Politics of the Divine. She is the one who should not have survived. Every mythology has a figure who does not fit the system, who operates by different rules, who keeps breaking the logic of the world they inhabit, who cannot be placed safely in any theological category. In Greek mythology, it is Dionysus. In Norse mythology, it is Loki. In Sumerian mythology, it is Inanna. But where Dionysus and Loki are ultimately marginal figures, troublemakers tolerated at the edges of divine society, Inanna is not marginal at all. She is at the absolute center of Sumerian religious life, the most widely and fervently worshipped deity in the Mesopotamian tradition. Temples to her were found across the ancient Near East. Thousands of hymns were composed in her honor. The first known author in literary history, Enheduanna, a princess and high priestess who lived around 2300 BCE, wrote some of the most extraordinary religious poetry ever produced as devotional hymns to Inanna. And Inanna, by the standards of the Sumerian divine order, is constantly doing things she should not be able to do. She descends to the underworld and comes back. No one else does this. The underworld is the realm of no return. The dead do not return. Inanna returns. The Anunnaki struck her dead, and she came back anyway. She steals the Me from Enki. In the text Inanna and Enki, the goddess travels to the Abzu at Eridu to visit Enki. They drink beer together. Enki, intoxicated, begins handing her the Me one by one, the divine ordinances, the source codes of civilization, the things he guards in the deepest vault of the world. He gives her kingship, the descent to the underworld, the craft of the scribe, the skill of the hero. He gives and gives until he has given her more than 100 Me. In the morning, sober, he sends his servant to get them back. Inanna has already loaded them on her boat and is sailing home. Enki sends sea monsters. They cannot stop her. He sends storms. They cannot stop her. She arrives in her city of Uruk with the me intact, with everything Enki gave her in his generosity, and then tried to take back when his generosity ran out. She has simply claimed what was offered. There is a reading of this text that sees it as a political allegory. The city of Uruk competing with the city of Eridu for divine patronage, with Uruk's goddess triumphing over Eridu's god. And this reading is probably correct at one level. Mesopotamian mythology was thoroughly politicized. Cities used their gods as claims to divine authority, and when a city's political fortunes rose, its deity was often credited with having defeated or cleverly outmaneuvered the deity of a rival city. But the theological content is still significant. Inanna's triumph over Enki in this text establishes her as a being whose relationship to divine authority is uniquely autonomous. She does not receive the me through proper channels, through divine assembly decisions, through Enlil's authorization. She drinks with Enki and takes what he offers. She operates in the informal economy of the divine world, in the spaces between the official structures, using charm and wit and the simple principle that a gift freely given cannot be taken back. She is, in this sense, a model of how mortal humans navigate divine authority. You cannot argue with Enlil. You cannot vote against the assembly. You cannot overpower Nergal or the 7 underworld judges, but you might be able to share a beer with the god of wisdom when he is feeling generous and take home more than you came for. This is not manipulation. The Sumerians were clear that Inanna earned what she got. She made the journey to the Ebzu. She sat with Enki. She accepted his gifts graciously. She defended them when he tried to reclaim them. The me were given freely, received freely, defended competently. If Enki regretted his generosity later, that was the consequence of his own choice. Inanna's relationship with the Anunnaki of the underworld is even more revealing of her unique status. When she descends to the underworld, she is stripped of her divine powers at each of the 7 gates. She arrives naked and bowed low before the 7 judges. They strike her dead. This is, by every rule of the universe, the end of her story. The underworld is the realm of no return. The Anunnaki have spoken. The verdict is rendered. And yet, Enki's intervention, using the small beings made from dirt under his fingernail, exploits a loophole, yes, but what makes the intervention possible is the character of Ereshkigal herself. The queen of the underworld is in pain. She is lamenting. The small beings mirror her pain, acknowledge it, honor it, and Ereshkigal, moved, offers them a gift. They ask for Inanna's corpse. The Anunnaki's judgment is technically fulfilled. Inanna died. The law says the dead do not return. But the law does not specifically prohibit the food of life and the water of life being administered to a corpse. The cosmological loophole is found not in the structure of divine authority, but in the emotional reality of Ereshkigal's grief. The universe contains a loophole, compassion. The dead do not return unless someone mourns them well enough that the queen of the dead is moved to grant a gift. The law is not overturned, but there exists within the structure of the cosmos a space where pure, unconditional acknowledgement of another being's suffering can produce an outcome that no force or authority could achieve. This is what Inanna's myth teaches that the alien god theory cannot accommodate. The possibility that the deepest power in the universe is not strength or technology or genetic engineering or even divine authority. It is the capacity to witness another person's pain without trying to fix it, to say, "I see you suffering" without an agenda, and to receive whatever is offered in return. The Anunnaki, the 7 judges of the underworld, presided over a court where this was possible. They did not block Ereshkigal's gift. They were bound by the law, but the law, as it turned out, was not as total as it seemed. The cosmos has grace built into it. not as a get-out-of-judgment-free card. Inanna still had to produce a substitute, and the substitute she chose, Dumuzi, still had to die, but as a real and effective power that could, under the right circumstances, undo even what the 7 judges had decided. Enheduanna, the historical priestess who composed the great hymns to Inanna, lived through a period of political catastrophe. Her father was Sargon of Akkad, the first empire builder in human history, who conquered the Sumerian city-states and imposed a new order. Enheduanna herself was appointed high priestess of the moon god's temple in Ur, and then, during a rebellion against Sargon's dynasty, she was expelled from her position. Her temple was violated, and she was exiled. Her hymn, The Exaltation of Inanna, is, among other things, a prayer from a woman in the worst moment of her life to the goddess who had herself been killed and come back. "I have given birth to this hymn for you," she writes, and the verb she uses, gave birth, is the same word used for human childbirth. She has labored over this prayer the way a woman labors over a child. She prays for Inanna's intervention. She prays for her own restoration. And the hymn ends with the restoration accomplished. She has returned to her position, her prayer has been answered, the goddess has acted. Whether this is historical fact or literary convention is, in a sense, beside the point. What matters is that a woman in 2300 BCE, in an age of bronze weapons and clay tablets, found in the mythology of Inanna's descent and return a theological resource adequate to her own suffering. She looked at the story of the goddess who was killed and came back, and she found in it not an alien's journey from another planet, but the promise that even the worst judgment is not necessarily final, that the universe has grace built into its structure, and that the 7 judges of the underworld, the Anunnaki themselves, are participants in a system that contains more than any single verdict can contain. That is a theology worth having. Chapter 8. Gilgamesh and the Refusal of Death. The most widely translated literary text from the ancient world is not a religious document. It is a story about a man who could not accept that his friend was dead. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which survives on 12 tablets in an Akkadian version compiled around 1200 BCE, though based on Sumerian sources 300 years older, is the oldest epic in human literature and one of the most psychologically penetrating narratives ever written. It is not primarily a story about the Anunnaki, but the Anunnaki are everywhere in it, as they are everywhere in the Mesopotamian world, the unseen architecture against which every human life is measured. Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk, 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, which means he has more divine blood than almost any human, but is still not free from the one universal condition: he will die. The first part of the epic is about his friendship with Enkidu, a wild man created by the gods to match Gilgamesh's power and check his arrogance, whom he meets, fights, befriends, and loves with an intensity that the text does not shy away from. They go on adventures together. They fight the demon Humbaba in the cedar forest. They kill the bull of heaven when the goddess Inanna sends it against them in revenge for Gilgamesh's rejection of her advances. And then Enkidu gets sick and dies. The text lingers on the death with a precision and rawness that is almost unbearable. Gilgamesh refuses to believe Enkidu is dead. He waits for 3 days. A worm falls from Enkidu's nose. Then he believes. And then he goes mad. Not violent mad, grief mad. He tears his clothes, rips the hair from his head, walks away from his kingdom, his responsibilities, his identity as king. He puts on a lion's skin and wanders in the wilderness. He cannot stop thinking about the fact that Enkidu is dead, and about the fact that he, Gilgamesh, will also die. The text is explicit. It is not just grief for Enkidu that drives him. It is the sudden, visceral, personal confrontation with his own mortality. He decides to find Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, the one man who was given eternal life by the gods. If Utnapishtim has eternal life, perhaps he can give the secret to Gilgamesh, or at least tell him where to find the plant of immortality that grows at the bottom of the sea. His journey is the structure of the epic's second half, and it is at every stage defined by encounters with beings who tell him the same thing in different ways. The Scorpion people, who guard the path of the sun, tell him, "No one has walked this path before." A tavern keeper named Siduri, one of the most memorable minor characters in ancient literature, tells him, "When the gods created mankind, they allotted death to mankind, but life they retained in their own keeping. As for you, Gilgamesh, let your belly be full, make merry day and night. Of each day make a feast of rejoicing, day and night dance and play. Let your garments be sparkling fresh, your head bathed in water. Cherish the little child who holds your hand. Let your wife delight in your embrace. These things alone are the concern of mankind." This is not a cynical Epicurean dismissal of the spiritual. Siduri is not telling Gilgamesh to forget about death. She is telling him that the appropriate response to mortality is presence. Be here. Be with the people who love you. Make the moment full, because the moment is all there is. Gilgamesh does not listen. He presses on. He finds Utnapishtim. He asks for the secret of immortality. Utnapishtim, as noted above, does not give him what he wants. He tells him the story of the flood instead. He shows Gilgamesh that he, Utnapishtim, has not enjoyed his eternal life. He is at the end of the world, alone except for his wife, cut off from everything that made mortal life valuable, the urgency, the love, the temporary nature of every pleasure which makes pleasure precious. He gives Gilgamesh a consolation, a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, not immortality itself, but the plant of rejuvenation, the plant of an old man becomes young again. Gilgamesh dives for it, gets it. He is on his way home. He stops to wash in a pool. A serpent smells the plant. The serpent takes it. The serpent sheds its skin and disappears. And Gilgamesh sits down on the shore and weeps. The serpent, the animal associated with Enki, with the wisdom that lives in the deep, has taken the plant of immortality, and the serpent has been renewed. The serpent sheds its skin. It does not die. It is transformed. Only the serpent, the creature of the underworld, the being that moves between worlds, gets to be renewed. The human, even the semi-divine human, the greatest man who ever lived, sits on the shore and weeps. This is the Anunnaki's truth in its most concentrated form. The gods created mortality for humanity as a formal decision. That decision was ratified by the divine assembly. The Anunnaki, the judges of ultimate reality, have pronounced it. And even the greatest human hero, armed with the wisdom of Enki and the strength of Enlil and the blessing of Shamash the sun god, cannot change the verdict. What he can do, what the epic reveals he does when he returns to Uruk empty-handed, is look at his sit. The epic ends with Gilgamesh speaking to his boatman Ur-Shanabi, the one he brought back from the edge of the world, the one who cannot return because he has been exiled by Utnapishtim. Gilgamesh points to the walls of Uruk. "Climb upon the wall of Uruk, walk along it, I say. Regard the foundation terrace, and examine the brickwork, if its brickwork be not of burnt bricks, and if the 7 wise men did not lay its foundations." He is pointing to the city as his legacy. He is pointing to the wall, the baked bricks, the foundation laid by the 7 sages, the antediluvian wise men who were believed to have brought civilization to humanity before the flood, the beings associated with Enki and the Me. The wall of Uruk is the city Gilgamesh built, the legacy he leaves, the thing that will outlast him. And then the final line, 1 square mile is city, 1 square mile is orchards, 1 square mile is clay pits, as well as the open ground of Ishtar's temple. 3 square miles and the open ground comprise Uruk. The epic ends with a property description. It ends with facts, measurable, surveyable, real facts about a city that can still be mapped today. The greatest human epic ever written ends not with transcendence, but with documentation. The mortal king returns from his quest for immortality, and the immortality he finds is the immortality of the built thing, the made thing, the civilization that outlasts its builders. The Anunnaki, in their role as judges of the underworld, had denied Gilgamesh what he asked for. But what the Anunnaki of heaven and earth, the divine ordinances, the Me, the source codes of civilization, had given him was the capacity to build something that death could not easily touch. Uruk stood for 3,000 years after Gilgamesh was said to have ruled it. The walls he built, or that were built in the name he represented, are still there under the desert sand. The judgment of the Anunnaki was not that Gilgamesh should die and be forgotten. The judgment was that he should die and leave behind something real. He did. Part 3. The Hidden Architecture. Chapter 9. The Tablet of Destinies, who really controls the future. There is an object that appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian mythology, and its importance cannot be overstated. It is called the Tablet of Destinies, Dup Shimati in Akkadian, the tablets on which the fates of all things are inscribed. Whoever holds the Tablet of Destinies controls the universe, not just the present universe, but all possible universes, all futures, all outcomes, all trajectories of every life from the moment of creation to the last breath of the last being. The Tablet of Destinies is not a scroll, not a book, not a database. It is closer to what modern physics might call a wave function, the totality of all possible states of the universe compressed into a single object that, in the act of being read, collapses possibility into actuality. The god who holds it is Enlil, but Enlil's hold on it is not permanent or uncontested. In the Akkadian myth known as Anzu, a colossal eagle demon named Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil while he is bathing. The theft is immediate and catastrophic. With Enlil no longer holding the tablets, the universe begins to fall apart. The assembly of the gods sits in silence. No one can function. The decrees of the gods lose their authority. The structures of reality begin to dissolve because the thing that was giving them structure has been stolen. The gods need someone to go and get it back. They ask the great hero gods, Anu, Adad, Shara. Each one refuses. The task is too dangerous. Anzu, holding the tablets of destinies, cannot be killed by conventional means. Any weapon aimed at Anzu is absorbed by the power of the tablets and heals him instantly. Finally, the god Ninurta, son of Enlil, the warrior god of the plow and the thunderstorm, volunteers. He fights Anzu. His weapons are absorbed. He is told by his advisor, Sharur, his own personified mace, to change strategy. Aim not at Anzu, but at Anzu's feathers. Make the feathers fly. When the feathers fall, Anzu's connection to the Tablets of Destinies is interrupted. In the moment of interruption, a conventional weapon will work. Ninurta does this. Anzu is killed. The tablets are recovered. The theological message seems straightforward. Don't steal from the gods. The rightful order will be restored. But there is something more disturbing underneath. The tablets of destinies can be stolen. The mechanism that runs the universe can be taken from its rightful holder and used by an illegitimate power. Reality itself can be hijacked. This is not a naive theology. The Sumerians and Babylonians were living in a world of constant political instability. Empires rose and fell. Cities were destroyed. Kings were assassinated. The entire structure of the world seemed to depend on forces that could shift without warning. The myth of the stolen tablets of destinies is a theology of political precarity. What happens when the structures that govern us are controlled by the wrong hands? The answer the myth provides is not reassuring. When the wrong hands hold the tablet, the right structures decay. The gods lose their authority. The heroes are frightened. It takes a specific kind of courage, the courage of Ninurta, who volunteers when everyone else refuses, and a specific kind of intelligence, the advice to attack indirectly, to undermine the connection rather than confront the power, to restore the right order. And even then, it is restored only temporarily. The myth does not say the tablet of destinies cannot be stolen again. The Anunnaki appear in the Anzu myth not as the perpetrators of the theft, but as the beings whose authority structure is disrupted by it. The assembly, the Anunnaki in their political function, is paralyzed. They are the legitimate authority of the universe, and legitimate authority, when faced with illegitimate power, often finds itself unable to act. The system designed for a world where everyone follows the rules does not automatically contain the resources to deal with someone who simply breaks them. This is uncomfortably contemporary. But the Tablet of Destinies myth also contains a less discussed theological innovation, the idea that fate is not fixed. If the Tablet of Destinies can be moved, can be held by different beings at different times, then destiny is not immutable. The future is written on a tablet that is, at least in principle, writable, erasable, rewritable. The Anunnaki who hold and interpret the tablets are not revealing a fixed future. They are participating in its creation. Their judgments, the verdicts rendered in the underworld, the decrees of the divine assembly, are the act of writing. And writing can be done wrong. The Mesopotamian scribal tradition understood this deeply. The cuneiform script was a living technology, not a fixed representation. A sign could mean different things in different contexts. A text could be read multiple ways. The same tablet could be a recipe, a prayer, a spell, or a political document depending on who was reading it and why. The scribes who copied and recopied great mythological texts were not merely preserving information, they were participating in an ongoing act of interpretation, of making meaning, of deciding what the past said to the present. When the Anunnaki hold the Tablet of Destinies, they are not simply reading the future, they are writing it. And when that tablet is stolen, the future is up for grabs. This is the most subversive theological claim in the entire Mesopotamian tradition, that the gods themselves do not have total control over destiny, that the structure of reality, for all its apparent fixity, contains genuine contingency, that what happens next is genuinely uncertain even to the beings who built the system. The Anunnaki are not omniscient. They are participants in an open-ended process. They are powerful, authoritative, real, but they are operating in a universe that has surprises in it, even for them. Chapter 10. The Descent into the Self, what the Kur really was. The underworld in Mesopotamian cosmology is called by several names. Kur is the oldest. It means both mountain and underworld. a paradox that makes perfect sense once you understand that the Sumerians thought of the earth as a dome and the underworld as the hollow space beneath the dome's foundation. To go down was to go into the mountain, into the stone itself, into the root of the world. But the underworld is also called the Great Land, Kigal in Sumerian, which becomes Ereshkigal's name, Queen of the Great Land. And it is called the Land of No Return, and it is called the House of Darkness, the Road of No Return, the house where one who enters is bereft of light. These are not descriptions of a physical location. They are phenomenological descriptions, descriptions of what it is like to be in a certain state. The Dead Sea Scrolls scholars who have studied this tradition alongside the Mesopotamian texts have noted that the descriptions of the underworld in the oldest Sumerian lamentations, the darkness, the dust, the silence, the absence of distinction, the feeling of being clothed in feathers like a bird, a metaphor for the soul in transition, read less like geography and more like a clinical description of severe depression. This is not a reductive observation. It is an expansive one. The Sumerians, in developing their mythology of the underworld, were doing something that no civilization before them had done. They were mapping the interior landscape of extreme psychological suffering onto the structure of the cosmos. They were saying that the darkest states of human inner life are not aberrations, not mere psychological phenomena, but genuine encounters with a dimension of reality that has divine significance. When Inanna descends to the underworld, she is not just making a mythological journey. She is modeling what it looks like to go into the deepest darkness voluntarily, to strip off every layer of identity, every power, every attribute, and encounter the naked reality beneath all of them. And the thing she encounters there is her own shadow, Ereshkigal, who is the dark mirror of her bright self. The two sisters are described in the texts as fundamentally opposed but structurally linked. Inanna is the goddess of heaven's light. Ereshkigal is the goddess of the underworld's dark. Inanna controls the morning star. Ereshkigal controls the night. They are not enemies in the simple sense. They are complementary aspects of a divided whole. And the division between them is maintained by the 7 gates of the underworld, the 7 passages through which Inanna must pass, surrendering a piece of herself at each one. The 7 gates are the 7 stages of descent into the self. The Anunnaki who judge at the bottom of those gates are not external authorities rendering external verdicts. They are the most honest part of the self, the part that cannot be fooled by clothing or jewelry or crowns, the part that sees nakedly and judges without mercy. When they strike Inanna dead, they are not executing a sentence for a crime. They are confronting her with the totality of what she is when all the external attributes are removed. They are asking, who are you without your power? What are you without your crown? The answer the myth gives is dead. Without power, without identity, without the external structures that define a being in the upper world, there is nothing left. The self is constituted by its attributes, and when the attributes are removed, the self ceases to exist. This is a position that modern psychology and philosophy would find deeply interesting. The idea that the self has no existence independent of its qualities, its powers, its relationships, that the stripped-down, naked self is a corpse, resonates with Buddhist concepts of anatta, no self, and with certain strands of contemporary neuroscience that argue there is no stable self underlying the stream of experience, only the experience itself. But Inanna comes back. The self is restored, reconstituted, brought back to life by the food of life and the water of life, administered by beings made from the dirt under a god's fingernails. The restoration is not a triumphant return to power. It is a fragile, careful, almost arbitrary-seeming process that depends on the emotional state of the underworld's queen, on the compassion of small beings, on the generosity of Ereshkigal in a moment of vulnerability. The self in this mythology is not robust. It is something that requires constant maintenance, that can be stripped away, that is only restored through the most delicate of processes. And the structures of the universe, the Anunnaki, the divine assembly, the cosmic law, do not automatically protect it. They protect the structure. The individual self is on its own, except for Enki, who is always making things from dirt under his fingernails and sending them to do quiet, anonymous, crucially important work. The descent to the underworld in Mesopotamian mythology is the template for what later traditions would call initiation. The mystery religions of the ancient world, the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, the Isis and Osiris cult in Egypt, the later Mithraic mysteries, all share the core structure of the Inanna myth: descent, death, and restoration. In each tradition, the initiate undergoes a symbolic death and is reborn as a different person. The Anunnaki preside over this process. They are the judges of the transformation, the keepers of the threshold, the beings who determine whether the descent was real, whether the death was complete, whether the restoration is genuine or merely performed. You cannot fake the descent. This is the teaching that the modern appropriation of the Anunnaki mythology consistently misses. In the alien god theory, the Anunnaki are external. They come, they build, they mine, they leave. Their relationship to humanity is that of a factory to its workers, or at best, a parent to very small children. There is no interior dimension to the encounter, no transformation, no demand that the human being actually change. The real Anunnaki mythology, the one embedded in 40,000 clay tablets, is entirely about interior transformation. It is about what happens when you go all the way down, when you lose everything, when the judges of the deepest reality look at you naked and strip away the last pretension. And it is about coming back, not unchanged, not triumphant, but alive. Inanna, when she returns from the underworld, is not the same goddess who descended. She has been to the place where the rules are kept, has been judged by the judges who cannot be fooled, has been killed and restored. She carries the underworld in her now. She is the queen of heaven who has also been a corpse on a hook in the deepest dark. This is why she is the goddess of love and war simultaneously. Not because the Sumerians were being careless about divine portfolios, because the being who has been to the underworld and returned knows both the sweetness of life and the reality of death, and that combination is what love and war both require. You cannot love without understanding loss. You cannot fight without understanding finality. The Anunnaki gave Inanna this understanding. They gave it to her by killing her. Chapter 11. The Royal Ideology. How Kings Became Gods, Became Kings. The Sumerian king list is one of the strangest documents ever produced. It begins before the flood with kings who ruled for impossibly long periods. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. Alalagar of Eridu ruled for 36,000 years. 8 kings before the flood ruling for a combined total of 241,200 years. Then, the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered again from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The antediluvian kings are the interface between the divine and the human. They are the period when the ME were fresh, when civilization was new, when the gods were more directly present. Their impossible lifespans are not meant to be understood biologically. They are theological statements about the quality of divine presence at the beginning of history. The further you get from the gods, the shorter the reign. The post-flood kings live hundreds of years. The historical kings live normal human lifespans. The Anunnaki are present throughout this history as the source of legitimate authority. Kingship does not originate in human society. It is lowered from heaven. The divine assembly decides which city will hold the sacred office of kingship, which ruler will have the divine backing, which throne will be legitimate. When kingship moves from city to city, from Kish to Uruk to Ur to Nippur, it is not because of military conquest alone. It is because the divine assembly has decided to move its support. The kings of Mesopotamia understood this. Their inscriptions consistently claim not just military victory, but divine mandate. Sargon of Akkad, the first empire builder, claimed that the goddess Ishtar, the Akkadian Inanna, loved him, that Enlil gave him the kingship of the 4 quarters of the world, that An confirmed his authority. His daughter, Enheduanna, the high priestess and poet, used her religious position to confirm the divine backing of her father's dynasty. This is not mere propaganda, though it was certainly propaganda too. It is a genuinely held theological position that legitimate authority requires divine backing, and that divine backing is bestowed by the Anunnaki, the great judges who manage the divine assembly and hold the ME. The king in Sumerian theology is the one human being who has been given direct access to a specific subset of the ME of kingship. These include the crown, the throne, the royal scepter, the staff and line, tools of surveying and construction, the art of descending to the underworld, the art of ascending from the underworld. The art of descending to the underworld, the art of ascending from the underworld. These are specifically listed in the ME of kingship. The king is not just a political leader. He is the being who goes to the underworld on behalf of his people and comes back. The ritual texts describe the king undergoing a symbolic death, in some traditions literally descending into a pit in the temple and lying there for 3 days, and then ascending, reborn, confirmed in his divine authority. The Anunnaki of the underworld judge him during his descent. They confirm his right to rule. He comes back from the place where the dead are judged and the living cannot usually go, and his community knows that he has been tested by the deepest judges in the cosmos and found worthy. This is the origin of a pattern that recurs across religions, the sacred king who must die to govern. The dying and rising gods that later traditions would celebrate, Tammuz and Dumuzi in Mesopotamia, Osiris in Egypt, Dionysus in Greece, and later in a different register, the Christ of Christianity, are all iterations of this pattern. The sacred leader who dies and returns, who has been to the underworld and come back, who governs by the authority not just of the living, but of the dead. The Anunnaki are the divine authority that makes this pattern possible. They are the judges who evaluate the king's worthiness in the underworld. Without their verdict, without the approval of the beings who have seen everything, who cannot be fooled, who judge by the deepest standards of cosmic justice, the resurrection is not legitimate. Anyone can claim to have gone to the underworld and come back. The Anunnaki's role is to verify the claim. This connects to something that academic scholars have noticed, but that the popular tradition has completely ignored. The Sumerian tradition contains the earliest version of something like an afterlife judgment. The idea that the soul after death is judged by divine beings, an idea central to later Egyptian theology, later Greek philosophy, Plato's description of the afterlife in the Phaedo and the Republic, and later still to Christian, Islamic, and Jewish eschatology, appears to originate in Mesopotamia, in the theology of the Anunnaki as underworld judges. The Book of the Dead in Egypt describes the deceased's heart being weighed against a feather, the heart representing the moral weight of the life lived. The Greek tradition describes three judges of the underworld, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. The Abrahamic traditions describe the final judgment, the weighing of deeds, the divine verdict that determines eternal fate. All of these are descendants, however many generations removed, of the 7 Anunnaki judges of the Sumerian underworld, the beings who looked at Inanna and struck her dead.
The idea that your life will be judged, that you will stand, naked of your external attributes, before beings who cannot be fooled, and that a verdict will be rendered, is perhaps the single most influential idea in human moral history. It has shaped legal systems, ethical traditions, personal behavior, and civilizational organization for 5,000 years. It continues to shape them now. And it originated with 7 unnamed judges in the deepest dark beneath the first city, 4,000 years before Rome, 5,000 years before the Renaissance, reading by the light of the universe's own fire. Chapter 12. The Lost Tablets, What We Will Never Know. Of the mythological literature of ancient Mesopotamia, we have fragments. This is not a small qualification. It is the defining condition of our knowledge. The 40,000 cuneiform tablets in museums around the world represent a fraction of what was written in ancient Mesopotamia. The great library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, the Neo-Assyrian king who collected every text he could find from across the ancient Near East, is estimated to have contained between 25,000 and 30,000 tablets. When the Babylonians sacked Nineveh in 612 BCE, the library burned. The tablets fell from the shelves and shattered, and centuries of heat and collapse fused many fragments together permanently, while countless others were lost forever to looters, erosion, and the simple dissolution that comes from clay meeting water. Every modern scholar who works in this field works with the knowledge that the most important texts may not survive. The text that would resolve the central theological questions, that would tell us clearly who the 7 Anunnaki of the underworld were, why they made the decisions they made, what the full structure of the divine assembly looked like, may be in pieces too small to reassemble, or dissolved back into the earth, or still buried under a mound in what is now Iraq that no archaeologist has excavated yet. There are things we know we don't know, and there are things we don't know we don't know. What we do know suggests that the picture we have is systematically distorted toward the spectacular and the royal. Most of the texts that survive were preserved in temple libraries and royal archives, which means they represent the official, authorized, politically useful version of the mythology. The everyday religion of ordinary Sumerians, the prayers said in private homes, the stories told to children, the traditions passed down through families outside of priestly and royal channels, is almost entirely lost. We know it existed. We have occasional glimpses. There's a category of Mesopotamian religious objects called the lamassu, protective spirits in the form of human-headed winged bulls or lions that appeared at the entrances of palaces and temples, massive stone sculptures meant to ward off evil. But the same beings also appear in household contexts, as small clay figurines buried under doorways were placed in the corners of rooms. The great lamassu of the palace gates were the king's version of something that every family also kept. The divine protection accessed by kings through elaborate temple rituals was also accessed by ordinary people through small clay figures and whispered prayers. The everyday relationship to the divine, to the Anunnaki, in their capacity as the background structure of all experience, was apparently not mediated entirely through kings and priests. It was personal, it was domestic, it was conducted in private, and we have almost none of it.
We also know, from passing references in the texts we do have, that there were stories that were considered too powerful or too dangerous to write down. The exorcists who performed the Maklu ritual apparently received a complete education in which certain traditions were transmitted orally from master to apprentice and were explicitly forbidden from being committed to clay. The reason given is that these traditions, if written, would give too. What were these oral traditions? We don't know. We can only infer from what they were used for. Combating the most dangerous forms of supernatural attack, dealing with the beings the texts call the Seven in their most active and threatening modes. The encounters at the deepest level of the Anunnaki mythology, the ones where the structure of reality itself was directly engaged, were apparently too important to risk being mishandled by the untrained. This is a consistent pattern across esoteric traditions throughout history. The most powerful knowledge is always withheld from general circulation. The mystery religion initiates of ancient Greece, the Kabbalah in Jewish tradition, and the esoteric inner teachings of various Buddhist schools all share the principle that certain kinds of knowledge require proper preparation and context, or they become dangerous. The information that looks like a secret is not kept secret because those in power want to maintain a monopoly. It is kept secret because the knowledge is genuinely risky when applied without understanding. The Anunnaki traditions suggest that the ancient Mesopotamians were operating with the same principle. The publicly accessible mythology, the flood story, the descent of Inanna, the Gilgamesh epic, gave a general framework for understanding the structure of divine reality. The priestly and scribal traditions gave a more detailed and more dangerous version. And the innermost oral traditions, now lost, apparently gave the full technical manual for direct engagement with the deepest forces in the cosmos. We cannot know what those traditions contained. We can only note their absence, the deliberate shape of the silence, and wonder. There is one more category of lost knowledge that is worth dwelling on. The ancient city of Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, sat at the bond between heaven and earth, the Enki. The rituals performed there by a highly specialized priesthood over a period of more than 3,000 years were the mechanism by which the Sumerians maintained the structural integrity of the cosmos. When the tablets describe the priests performing their rituals in the Ikur, they are not describing symbolic acts. They are describing the maintenance of the cosmic bond that held reality together. What were those rituals? Some we know. The New Year's festival, the sacred marriage ritual, the great lamentations sung for the destroyed cities. But the innermost rites of the Ikur, the rituals performed in the Holy of Holies at the point where heaven and earth were joined, are not described in any surviving text. They were apparently too sacred to write down. We have the result of the rituals, a civilization that lasted 3,000 years, that invented writing and mathematics and astronomy and agriculture and law and the city and the library, that gave us the flood story and the creation epic and the first love poetry and the first political satire and the first lullabies. We do not have the process. The Anunnaki, as the gods invoked at the center of those rituals, are therefore present to us as outlines rather than solid figures. We know their names, some of them. We know their functions, some of them. We know the mythology built around them, some of it. What we do not know is what it felt like to actually encounter them in the ritual context, to be the priest standing at the bond of heaven and earth in the dark of the temple's innermost chamber, invoking the 7 great judges, asking them to maintain the structure of the world for another year. What did they answer? The tablets do not say. The tablets only say that the priests went in and the world did not end. Year after year, for 3,000 years, the priests went in and the world did not end. And then the priests stopped going in. The temples were destroyed, the traditions were lost, the rituals were forgotten, and eventually the civilization that had maintained the bond between heaven and earth for 3 millennia dissolved into the desert. And the world still did not end. Either the Anunnaki had moved on to other arrangements, or the bond maintained itself, or the priests had been wrong about what they were doing. Or, and this is the possibility that the mythology itself suggests, the bond between heaven and earth is maintained not by ritual alone, but by the daily act of being a human civilization. Building cities, writing poetry, falling in love, grieving the dead, caring for the children, sweeping the temple, placing the offering, showing up every day and making meaning in a universe that does not automatically provide it. That is what the Anunnaki asked for. That is what they made us to do. And that is what we have never, in 50,000 years of human culture, stopped doing. Chapter 13. The Parallel Traditions. Egypt, India, and the Memory of Something Older. If the Anunnaki were merely a Mesopotamian invention, a local theological system developed in the river valleys of Iraq and nowhere else, we would expect them to have no resonance outside their original context. We would find no echoes, no parallel structures, no independent traditions that seem to have arrived at the same conclusions without knowing about each other. We find the opposite. The problem with pointing to parallels is that it can become an argument for a single origin, the claim that a universal ancient religion once existed, that all myths are reflections of a single truth that was once known to all humanity and has since fragmented. This claim is seductive, and it is also unfalsifiable, which is to say, it is not the kind of claim that historical scholarship can properly evaluate. We cannot know whether the parallels between Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Indian, and Greek mythology reflect a common origin, independent invention, early contact between cultures, or simply the fact that human beings everywhere confront the same basic existential problems and tend to develop similar conceptual tools for dealing with them. What we can say is this: the parallels are real, they are striking, and they suggest that the Anunnaki mythology is not a local anomaly. It is a crystallization of something that human beings, in many places and many times, have found it necessary to think about. The Egyptians developed their own divine assembly, the Ennead of Heliopolis, the 9 primordial gods from whom all other gods descended. Like the Anunnaki, the Ennead were beings who presided over the structure of reality, not the daily operation of the world, but the fundamental architecture that made the world possible. Atum, the self-created, who spoke himself into existence in the primordial darkness. Shu and Tefnut, air and moisture, the division that creates the space for things to exist. Jeb and Nut, earth and sky, whose eternal embrace had to be interrupted for life to occur. The Egyptian underworld, Duat, has the same structural relationship to the upper world as the Sumerian Kur. It is beneath, it is dark, it is the place of judgment, and it is governed by a divine authority, in Egypt's case, Osiris, who has himself died and been restored. The 42 assessors of the Egyptian dead are functional equivalents of the Anunnaki judges, divine beings before whom the soul stands naked and is evaluated by standards that cannot be influenced. The Indian Vedic tradition has the Adityas, divine beings, sons of the cosmic principle Aditi, who govern specific aspects of the moral order. Varuna, among them, is specifically the god of cosmic law and the guardian of the Rita, the fundamental order of the universe, which operates independently of divine will. Varuna sees everything. He cannot be deceived. He judges violations of the moral order with inexorable precision. He corresponds, structurally, to the Anunnaki judges in their role as keepers of the cosmic law. The Vedic underworld, Naraka, is governed by Yama, the first man to die, who became the king of the dead. Like Nergal descending to Ereshkigal's realm, Yama's authority over the dead is established through his own experience of death. He knows what the dead face because he faced it first. In the Zoroastrian tradition, the religion that emerged from the Iranian plateau and would profoundly influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the divine beings are divided into two camps: the Ahura, lords, beings of the ordered world, related linguistically to the Vedic Asuras, and the Daiva, beings of chaos. The division between ordered and chaotic divine power, between the Anunnaki's structured authority and the forces they perpetually combat, is here elevated to a cosmic dualism that would shape Western religious thought for 3,000 years. The point is not that all these traditions derive from Sumer. The point is that all of them are responding to the same fundamental recognition that the universe contains a structure that is prior to human experience, that this structure has something like agency or will, that it makes judgments about human behavior, and that the most important thing a civilization can do is align itself with that structure rather than against it. The Anunnaki are Mesopotamia's name for this recognition. The Ennead is Egypt's name. The Adityas is India's name. The Ahura Mazda is Iran's name. The Elohim is the Canaanite and Hebrew name. The Olympians, in their most serious philosophical elaboration, are Greece's name. Different names, the same architecture. And the architecture has this consistent feature. The ultimate judges are not benevolent in the soft, sentimental sense of wishing you well regardless of what you do. They are just. And justice is not the same as mercy. Justice is the principle that what you do has consequences that are proportional to the doing. The universe keeps accounts. The 7 judges of the underworld are the accounting department of reality. This is not a primitive idea that sophisticated modernity has outgrown. It is the most sophisticated idea that civilization has ever produced. The conviction that actions have consequences, that those consequences are not random but structured, that the structure is knowable and navigable and must be respected. This is the foundation of every legal system, every ethical tradition, every scientific enterprise that has ever existed. The Anunnaki, the great gods who descended and judged and built and maintained, are not ancestors in the biological sense. They are ancestors in the intellectual sense. The conceptual beings whose existence made it possible for human civilization to understand itself as operating in a structured universe where what you do matters. Without them, without the cognitive and cultural apparatus they represent, there is no moral order. There is only power. And power without moral order is what the Mesopotamians described as chaos, as the return of the primordial waters, as the world before civilization, where everything was darkness and no one could hear the name of anything because nothing had yet been given a name. The Anunnaki named things. They gave the world its structure. They told humanity, this is what exists, this is what it does. These are the consequences of doing otherwise. We are still living in the universe they named. Chapter 13. The Sacred Marriage, when Heaven Consummated Earth. No aspect of Sumerian religion has been more misunderstood, more sanitized, more sensationalized, or more completely misread by the popular tradition than what scholars call the sacred marriage rite, hieros gamos in Greek, the term modern scholars generally use. The popular tradition either ignores it entirely because it doesn't fit the cosmic administrator model of the Anunnaki, or distorts it into something pornographic and salacious, a divine sex cult that titillates without illuminating. Neither approach gets anywhere near what the Sumerians were actually doing. The sacred marriage was the central ritual of the Sumerian New Year's festival. At its core, it involved the union of the king with the goddess Inanna, not literally in most scholarly interpretations, though there is still significant debate about the physical nature of the rite, and what that union was understood to produce: the fertility of the land, the prosperity of the year to come, the renewed legitimacy of the king's authority, and the continued health of the bond between heaven and earth. To understand the sacred marriage, you have to understand what the Sumerians meant by fertility. Fertility, in the Sumerian theological imagination, was not merely the biological capacity of the earth to grow crops. It was the principle of creative abundance that pervaded all dimensions of existence. The fertility of the fields was the same principle as the fertility of human relationships, of artistic creation, of political prosperity, of divine energy itself. When the crops grew, when love flourished, when the king governed wisely, when the scribes composed great literature, all of these were expressions of the same underlying force, which was personified in Inanna. Inanna was the goddess of everything alive and generative. She was called the Queen of Heaven and Earth, the Morning Star, the Lady of Lapis Lazuli, the one who, from the earliest times, has never said no to heaven. She was the one who wept with such passion for her dying lover Dumuzi that her grief literally prevented the world from reproducing. Plants did not grow, animals did not mate, humans lost all desire, until she descended to the underworld to retrieve him. Her great love hymn, the Hymn to Inanna, composed partly by Enheduanna and partly accumulated over centuries of liturgical tradition, is one of the most beautiful and startling documents in the ancient world. My vulva, the horn, the boat of heaven, is full of eagerness like the young moon, the text begins. My untilled land lies fallow. And then the dialogue with the king. Who will plow my vulva? Who will plow my high field? Who will plow my wet ground? This is liturgical poetry. It was sung in temples. It was performed at festivals. The imagery is explicitly erotic and explicitly agricultural simultaneously, because in the Sumerian theological framework, these are not two different things. The same act, performed at the cosmic level, produces both. The Anunnaki's role in the sacred marriage is structural. The divine assembly had determined, in that primordial deliberation at the beginning of things, that the bond between heaven and earth, established by the cosmic principles of An and Ki, by Enlil's separation of the two, had to be actively maintained. The me of kingship included specifically the right of the king to embody the divine principle on earth. The sacred marriage was the ritual expression of this embodiment. The king, in his divine capacity, united with the goddess, who was the active creative force of the universe, and the union produced everything the world needed for another year. This is theology, not pornography. The erotic dimension is inseparable from the theological one, because the Sumerians did not experience the same categorical separation between body and spirit that later Platonic and then Christian thought would impose on Western civilization. The body was not a lesser thing from which the spirit needed to be liberated. The body was the medium through which divine forces operated in the world. The most sacred act was also the most physical. The Anunnaki, as the judges and maintainers of the cosmic structure, were the divine authority behind this ritual. When the king united with Inanna, whether literally in a physical rite or symbolically through the construction and adorning of the goddess's sacred bed, as some scholars argue was more likely, it was a transaction conducted under the authority of the divine assembly. The Anunnaki determined that the king was worthy of this union. They had judged him, as they judged all kings in the symbolic descent to the underworld, and found him adequate to the task of standing in for the male principle of creation. The hymns to Inanna include some of the most sophisticated love poetry in any human literature. The lover's journey to his beloved, the preparation of the bridal chamber, the description of his beauty and hers, the physical union and its cosmic consequences, all of it is rendered with a specificity and a tenderness that feels astonishingly contemporary. The Sumerians were not embarrassed by love. They were not prudish about desire. They were not divided about the relationship between the physical and the divine. They thought that when two people, or a person and a goddess, came together in genuine love, something happened that was not reducible to the two individuals. Something was created that belonged to the universe itself. The Anunnaki were the witnesses and the validators of that creation. They were the beings who confirmed, yes, this union is genuine. Yes, the world has been renewed. Yes, the bond between heaven and earth has been maintained for another year. The most important detail of the sacred marriage ritual, the one that is almost never discussed, is what happened the morning after. In the texts, the morning after the sacred marriage is described in specific and consistent terms. Inanna wakes. She addresses the king. She blesses him, confirms his authority, enumerates the gifts she is giving him, a long reign, the loyalty of his people, the prosperity of his land, victory over his enemies. She is the source of his legitimacy. The union is not merely personal, it is politically productive. The king has demonstrated, through the sacred marriage, that he has the capacity to be the husband of heaven, the male principle, capable of sustaining the goddess's creative force. And in return, he receives everything that divine creative force can bestow. And then, in the mythological version that underlies the historical rite, Inanna leaves. She goes back to heaven. The king is alone on earth, king of a mortal kingdom, for another year, until the next new year, until the next sacred marriage, until the next renewal of the bond. This rhythm, union, blessing, separation, duration, and renewal, is the rhythm of the Sumerian year, the Sumerian cosmology, the Sumerian understanding of what it means to be a mortal being in a universe governed by immortal forces. The sacred is not permanently accessible. It visits, it blesses, it departs, and in its absence you live the life it has made possible, and you wait for its return. And when the new year comes, you go through the ritual again, and it comes back, and you are blessed again. The Anunnaki preside over this rhythm. They are the principles that make it reliable. Not every year will be prosperous. Not every union will be fruitful. But the structure is real, the rhythm is real, and the ritual that acknowledges and maintains it is not superstition. It is the most sophisticated response humanity has ever developed to the question of how to live in a world that gives and takes, that blesses and destroys, that loves and judges with the same impartial hand. There are texts, fragmentary, imperfectly preserved, partially untranslated, that suggest the sacred marriage tradition had an inner dimension that was never fully committed to the public record. The relationship between Inanna and the king in these private texts is described not as a royal transaction, but as a genuine relationship, with yearning on both sides, with the king missing the goddess during her absence, with Inanna in heaven thinking of her mortal lover with something that the texts do not quite call regret, but comes close. The goddess loves the mortal. The mortal will die. The goddess will attend another sacred marriage next year with another king who has proven himself in the symbolic descent. And the next year's king will also die, and the year after that. Inanna is the immortal who loves the mortal for the duration of his mortality, knowing that what she loves will end, knowing that the next time she descends to the festival, the man she is holding will be gone, or old, or changed beyond recognition, knowing that the bond she makes each year is by definition temporary. This is not comfortable mythology. It does not resolve neatly. But it is honest about something that every human being knows and struggles with, that the things we love most are mortal, that the most intense experiences are also the most temporary, that the union between the sacred and the ordinary, between heaven and earth, is always real, and always temporary, and always renewed. The Anunnaki, who preside over the sacred marriage as the authority that makes it legitimate, are the beings who have held this truth from the beginning. They have watched 10,000 sacred marriages, 10,000 kings come and go, 10,000 years of the mortal loving the immortal and losing her to her return to heaven. They have watched Inanna love and grieve for Dumuzi 10,000 times, one for each year of history, and they have not blinked. They have not looked away. They are the witnesses. They are the ones who know the whole story from beginning to end and choose each year to ratify it anyway, to confirm the king, to bless the union, to allow the world to continue its mortal and sacred entanglement for another year. This is what the Anunnaki are, in their fullest expression. The beings who know that existence is temporary, that what is beloved will be lost, that the structure of the cosmos demands both the flowering and the wilting, and who, knowing all of this, say, yes, let it continue. Let the king come to the goddess. Let the earth receive the rain. Let the cities be built, and the libraries filled, and the laments sung, and the sacred marriages celebrated. Let it continue. The world is worth what it costs. And in the morning, when the goddess has gone back to heaven, and the king is alone on his throne in a mortal city, surrounded by mortal people, governing for a year that will end and be followed by another year that will also end, in that morning, the Anunnaki's blessing rests on him like lapis lazuli in sunlight, deep blue, gold-flecked, the color of the sky that the gods live in, found here, on earth, in this breakable human-made thing. The color of heaven, given to earth. The bond, maintained, for one more year. Part 4, The Return. Chapter 14, The Lament for Sumer, When the Gods Left. Around 2000 BCE, something catastrophic happened to the civilization that had developed in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley over the preceding millennium. The cities fell. Not all at once, and not forever, but within a period of 2 to 3 generations, the great Sumerian city-states, Nippur, Lagash, Eridu, the oldest settlements of human civilization, were sacked, burned, depopulated. The culprit was partly the Amorites, semi-nomadic peoples from the Syrian desert who had been infiltrating the cities for generations and now swept through them in force. It was partly the Elamites from the east, who had long existed in uneasy tension with the Sumerian polities. It was partly ecological catastrophe, the salinization of agricultural land from centuries of intensive irrigation, the silting of canals, the failure of the agricultural base that had fed the cities for 1,000 years. The third dynasty of the last great Sumerian state, collapsed around 2004 BCE. Was sacked. Its king, Ibi-Sin, was taken into captivity in Elam. The city, which had been the greatest in the world, was destroyed. The Sumerians wrote about this with a depth of grief that has rarely been equaled in any literature. The texts produced in the aftermath of the collapse are called the Mesopotamian Lamentations,
a genre of literature specifically designed to process the destruction of cities and the departure of their divine patrons. The lamentation over the destruction of the lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and the lamentation over the destruction of Nippur. These texts run to hundreds of lines each, and they are among the most emotionally devastating documents in the entire ancient record.
The theology of the Lamentations is remarkable in its honesty. The cities were not destroyed because the gods were absent and couldn't help. The cities were destroyed because the gods chose to leave. The divine assembly, presided over by Enlil, made the decision to allow the destruction. The Anunnaki confirmed it, and then the individual protective deities of each city, the city's divine patron, the Lamassu guardians, the tutelary spirits of specific temples, got up and walked out. The lamentation over describes the moment when Nanna, the moon god and divine patron of left his city before the Elamites arrived. The god did not fight. He did not protect his city. He was present when the decision was made to destroy it, and when the decree was issued by Enlil and ratified by the Anunnaki, he complied. He left. Nanna, you have become estranged from your city like a stranger, the lamentation says. You have become estranged from your temple like an enemy. The evil storms of Enlil have brought you tears. But the text is more nuanced than an accusation. Nanna did not want to leave. He pleaded with the divine assembly. He argued for his city. He went to to Enlil, to the great mother goddess. Enlil has established the decreed fate for he is told. It cannot be altered. The Anunnaki's judgment is inexorable. Even the protective deity of the greatest city in the world, even a god who loves his city, cannot override the cosmic verdict. The structures of reality do not make exceptions. And then the text shifts to something extraordinary. It shifts to the perspective of the goddess Ningal, Nanna's wife, the divine protector of who is also leaving. She does not leave without speaking. She says, "In those days, indeed, I was no longer the mistress of my own fate. I could not avert the evil of the distant days when the storm would sweep over the land. My city was to be destroyed, my house demolished, its people taken captive. But I was the lady who dwelt in a land that was destroyed. The night of the weeping has passed. The tears of the night were offered to the daybreak, but the bright day could not cool my burning heart." This is not the voice of an omnipotent deity who decides to destroy a city. This is the voice of a being who is constrained by a power larger than herself, who loves what she is losing, who cannot stop it, who continues to mourn long after it is over. Ningal is in the same position as the human beings who lost The Anunnaki's judgment was applied to her as much as to the people. She is not the cause of the suffering, she is another victim of it. And yet she did not interfere to prevent it, even though she could see it coming. Because the divine assembly had decided, and Enlil had decreed, and the Anunnaki had judged, and those structures are not optional. They are the architecture of reality. To violate them is to unravel something more important than any single city. The Sumerians, in the Lamentations, are processing a theological crisis. If the Anunnaki governed the world, if the divine assembly made the decisions that structured history, if the gods were real and powerful and present, then why did fall? The crisis is the oldest one in religious thought, the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, the problem of a structured universe in which terrible things happen to people who did not deserve them.
The Lamentations' answer is not satisfying in the way that comfort is satisfying. It does not say the people of deserved their fate. It does not say the destruction was secretly good. It does not say the gods were absent or absent-minded or incompetent. It says the Anunnaki decided. The cosmic law required it. The city's time was over, and the gods who loved it wept. That is not a comfortable answer. It is an honest one. It says that the universe's justice and the universe's mercy are not the same thing, that the judges of the deepest reality can make decisions that cause enormous suffering, and that the beings who love the sufferers are themselves part of the suffering. The Anunnaki are not distant, cold administrators who process the destruction of civilizations without feeling. The mythology is clear that they feel. Ningal's lament is as full of grief as any human elegy. But they act anyway, because the structure requires it. This is the theological claim at the heart of the lamentation tradition, that the universe's deepest justice sometimes demands the destruction of what is beloved, not because it is cruel, because the alternative, a universe that makes exceptions for love, that protects the beloved from consequence, that suspends its own laws in response to grief, would be a universe without genuine structure, without real justice, without the framework that makes civilization possible in the first place. The Anunnaki's hard justice is the price of the hard world in which beautiful things can exist. Without the inexorable structure they represent, the cities could not have been built in the first place. The same force that destroyed was the force that made possible. The judges who decreed its end were the judges who once lowered kingship from heaven to its first foundation. The Sumerians knew this. It did not make the weeping stop, but it made the weeping meaningful. And in the Lamentations, the grief is given its full due. Hundreds of lines, exquisite poetry, specific named mourning for specific named streets and temples and gates. Nothing is minimized. Everything is honored. And then the city is rebuilt. Was rebuilt. Nippur was rebuilt. The rituals resumed. The priests returned. The bond between heaven and earth was reestablished, however imperfectly, however temporarily. The Anunnaki's judgment was not the end of civilization. It was one of civilization's recurring crises, and civilization, with that characteristically human stubbornness, refused to stay destroyed. This is the other face of the lamentation tradition. The grief is complete, and then it is over. And then there is work to do.
Chapter 15. The Exorcist's Manual, Living with the Divine in Daily Life. The ordinary Babylonian of 700 BCE did not spend much time thinking about cosmological theology. What they thought about, what their religious practice was primarily organized around, was the question of why things went wrong and what could be done about it. This is not a theological shallowness. It is a different level of theological engagement. The great myths of the Anunnaki operated at the level of cosmic structure: creation, flood, descent, judgment, restoration. They addressed the largest questions about the nature of reality and humanity's place in it, but they did not address directly the questions that occupied daily life. Why am I ill? Why has my business failed? Why did my child die? Why do I feel watched, followed, menaced by an invisible presence? For these questions, the Mesopotamians had a different tradition, the therapeutic religious tradition of the exorcist, the Ashipu, who diagnosed and treated what they understood as supernatural attacks and withdrew divine protection. The concept underlying this practice was simple and consistent. Health and prosperity depend on divine protection. Every individual, family, household, and city had protective divine beings, personal gods, household spirits, tutelary deities, who stood between their charges and the hostile forces of the universe.
When those protective beings withdrew, because of ritual error, moral violation, or simple bad luck, the individual became vulnerable to attack from the seven, from wandering demons, from curses, from the malevolence of other people. The exorcist's job was to diagnose which protection had been withdrawn, why, and how to restore it.
The diagnostic process was sophisticated. The Maklu ritual texts, which survive in the complete 12-tablet compilation from Ashurbanipal's library, describe elaborate procedures for determining the nature of an attack. The exorcist would perform rituals at night, specifically at the midpoint of the night, when the seven were most active, using fire, water, incense, figurines made of clay or wax, herbs, and words. The words were central, long incantations that named and described the attacking force, that described the protective forces being invoked, that narrated the desired outcome in precise, specific language. The language mattered because, in Mesopotamian theology, the word and the thing named were intimately connected. To speak the name of the attacking force was to bring it into visibility, to strip away its ability to act invisibly. To speak the name of the protective deity was to summon their presence. The incantation was a technology of reality management. It used language to reshape the invisible forces that governed experience. The seven Anunnaki appear in these texts in multiple capacities. They are sometimes the beings being invoked for protection. They are sometimes the beings whose cosmic authority the exorcist appeals to. They are sometimes the beings whose judgment the exorcist asks to be applied to the attacking force, to sentence the demon or the witch to the underworld, to render them subject to the same inexorable law that governs all things. By the command of Anu and Enlil, by the command of Ea and Asaluhi, by the command of Marduk, let the witch who has bewitched me be bound, let her mouth be stopped, let her tongue be cut off, let her eyes fail, let her be struck down before the judgment of the great gods. This is not a request for divine violence, it is a request for divine justice. The exorcist is asking the Anunnaki to apply their cosmic authority to a specific local situation. The witch who has caused harm has violated the cosmic order. She has used the divine powers of creation destructively, which is the deepest defense against the structure of the universe. The exorcist is asking the judges of that structure to notice the violation and respond.
What is striking about this tradition is how democratizing it is. The great cosmic judges, the Anunnaki, An and Enlil and Ea, are being addressed not by the king, not by the high priest in the innermost chamber of the Ikur, but by an exorcist making a house call, probably in a modest private home, on behalf of a sick person who has had a run of bad luck. The Anunnaki's authority in the exorcism tradition is available to everyone. The cosmic structure does not require royal mediation. It can be addressed directly through the proper knowledge of how to speak and what to do and when to do it. The exorcist is not performing royal ritual. He is performing the ordinary ritual maintenance of a cosmos that requires constant attention at every level. This democratization of access to divine authority is one of the most significant features of Mesopotamian religion that the popular tradition entirely misses. The Anunnaki are not the gods of kings. They are the gods of the cosmos, accessible, in principle, with proper preparation and knowledge, to everyone who lives in it. The Maklu ritual's central moment is the burning of the effigy. The exorcist makes a clay or wax figure representing the source of the attack, the witch, the demon, the hostile force. He names it, describes it, accuses it before the great gods, and then he burns it. The fire consumes the figure, and with it the connection between the hostile force and the victim is severed. I burn you, I incinerate you, the incantation says. Your smoke shall rise to the sky. Your ash shall not return to the earth. In the river your name shall be dissolved. Anu shall curse you,
Enlil shall curse you. Ea shall curse you. All the great gods shall curse you. What is remarkable is not the magic. Similar rituals appear in every culture throughout history, but the theological structure in which the magic is embedded. The curse being reversed is being reversed not by a human act of will, but by an appeal to divine authority. The exorcist is not the agent of the healing, the Anunnaki are. The exorcist is the one who knows how to ask. This positions the human practitioner in exactly the same relationship to divine power that the myths describe, not as a controller of divine forces, but as a navigator of them. You cannot make the Anunnaki do anything. You can make yourself audible to them. You can present your case. You can perform the rituals that demonstrate your seriousness, your preparation, your alignment with the cosmic order. And then the judges decide. This theology produced a civilization that was deeply, pervasively, practically religious in a way that is almost impossible to imagine from a modern secular perspective. Not religious in the sense of weekly attendance at formal ceremonies. Religious in the sense that every decision, every illness, every success and failure, every night and morning was understood to be taking place within a structure governed by beings of immense power who were paying attention. The Anunnaki were not absent gods who had to be reminded of your existence. They were present, aware, and interested. Whether this was psychologically healthy or unhealthy is a genuinely interesting question. The Mesopotamian tradition includes both the lament tradition, the full, legitimate expression of grief and protest, and the thanksgiving tradition, the proper acknowledgement of when things went well. Both are addressed to the same divine beings. Both are taken seriously. The gods receive your protests when things are terrible. They receive your gratitude when things are good. The relationship is continuous, encompassing, inescapable. And this is, in the end, what the Anunnaki mythology is about, the inescapability of the structure of reality. You cannot opt out. You cannot pretend the judges are not there. You cannot live a human life in a structured universe without being subject to that structure. The exorcists knew this. The poets knew it. The kings knew it. The ordinary families burying their Lamassu figurines under their doorways knew it. The question was never whether the Anunnaki existed. The question was how to live well in the world they governed. The Mesopotamians had answers to that question that took 3,000 years to develop, and that we have, in our modernity, largely forgotten. They were not perfect answers, but they were serious ones, developed by serious people who were paying very close attention to the structure of reality as they actually experienced it. We could do worse than to pay the same attention. Chapter 16. The Legacy. How the Anunnaki Built Western Civilization. The path from the clay tablets of ancient Sumer to the smartphone in your pocket is not direct. It is not a single line of inheritance, but a vast network of borrowed, transformed, forgotten, and rediscovered ideas, each generation taking what it needed from what came before and discarding what it didn't understand or couldn't use. But the path is real. And at several crucial junctures, the Anunnaki mythology, or the structures of thought that the Anunnaki mythology represents, made the difference between whether a key idea survived or not. The most obvious legacy is the flood story. The Epic of Gilgamesh was translated from Akkadian by the British Museum's George Smith in 1872, and when he read the flood narrative on the tablet, the rain, the boat, the birds sent out to find land, the dove that returned, the olive branch, he was so overcome that he ran out of the room. He recognized what he was holding, a version of the Noah story older than Genesis itself, predating the biblical text by 1,000 years. The discovery was a cultural earthquake. It threw Victorian England into theological turmoil. If the flood story was not original to the Bible, if it had a Babylonian predecessor, What did that mean for the Bible's claim to divine inspiration? The debates that followed were intense and are not fully resolved today, but they established for the first time in Western intellectual history that the Bible's narratives were part of a larger Near Eastern literary tradition, not unique revelations from a deity that existed apart from all other religious traditions.
This was the beginning of modern comparative religion, and it was made possible by the clay tablets, by the Anunnaki mythology, by the 40,000 cuneiform texts that scholars were beginning in the 1870s to actually read. But the legacy goes deeper than the flood story. It goes to the root of Western religious thought. The Hebrew Bible, which became the foundation of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, was composed in a cultural context saturated with Mesopotamian ideas. The Hebrew people had direct historical contact with Mesopotamia. The Abraham narratives begin in Ur of the Chaldees. The Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE brought the entire intellectual and religious elite of Judah into direct contact with Babylonian religion and scholarship. The book of Daniel is set in the Babylonian court. The book of Ezekiel, written during the exile, is full of imagery that reads like a direct response to Babylonian mythology. The El of the Canaanite pantheon, the divine assembly, the council of the gods, the father deity of the Semitic world, has direct structural parallels with the Anunnaki assembly. The Hebrew Elohim, the word translated as God in the opening of Genesis, is grammatically plural. In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. The Elohim, grammatically, are a company. And the divine assembly in the Psalms and in Job and in the vision of the prophet Micaiah ben Imlah, I saw the Lord sitting on his throne and all the host of heaven standing about him on his right and on his left, is the divine assembly, the gathering of beings who deliberate and decide, the structure that the Anunnaki mythology had described for 2,000 years before the Hebrew texts were compiled. The God of the Hebrew Bible is not the Anunnaki. He is not one of them, but he is described within a conceptual framework that was built by the Anunnaki tradition, using structural elements that the Mesopotamian theology had developed, operating in a universe that had been thought about through the framework the Sumerians established. This is not syncretism, it is cultural inheritance. Every intellectual tradition develops within the context of what came before it. The Hebrew theological revolution, the insistence on a single God, the ethical monotheism, the covenant relationship, took place within a Near Eastern context where the Anunnaki mythology had already done the foundational work of establishing that divine beings governed the cosmos, that they judged the living and the dead, that they maintained the structure of reality, that humanity had been created for a relationship with these beings and bore responsibilities to them. What the Hebrew tradition added to this framework was not a new cosmology, but a new ethics. It insisted that the divine assembly was not multiple beings with competing interests, but a single being with a unified will. It insisted that this single being's interest in humanity was not merely functional. The divine assembly wanted their temples maintained and their offerings made, but personal, covenantal, historical. And it insisted that the relationship between human and divine could be direct, not mediated through king and priest alone, but available to any individual who chose to enter it. These are transformations, not replacements. The Anunnaki gave Western civilization its basic theological vocabulary. The Hebrew tradition, and later the Greek philosophical tradition, and later still the Christian and Islamic traditions, developed that vocabulary into something new. The Greek tradition took a different path with the same material. Greek philosophy, from its very beginnings in the 6th century BCE, was engaged with the problem of the divine structure of reality, with what the universe was made of, how it was governed, what it meant that there were forms and patterns underlying the chaos of experience. Plato's ideal forms, the eternal templates that earthly things imperfectly reflect, are a philosophical translation of the Mesopotamian ME, the divine ordinances that are the source codes of civilized reality. Aristotle's unmoved mover, the being that sets the universe in motion without itself being moved, is a philosopher's version of An, the sky god, whose authority was so remote and absolute that he was effectively inactive, but whose presence was the condition for everything else. The Roman legal tradition, which became the basis of all Western law, incorporated the Mesopotamian principle that law was not human invention, but divine gift. Roman law theorized its own foundations as natural law, principles that derived not from human agreement, but from the rational structure of the universe, the same rational structure that the Anunnaki were said to maintain. The concept that a legal system must be answerable to a standard higher than itself, that there is a law above the law, a justice above the law court's justice, is the direct philosophical descendant of the 7 underworld judges before whom Inanna stood. The entire structure of Western civilization, its theology, its philosophy, its legal tradition, its narrative arts, its understanding of the relationship between human life and cosmic order, is built on a foundation whose deepest stratum was laid by people who worshipped 7 unnamed judges in the dark beneath a city called Eridu 4,000 years ago. We have built many things on top of that stratum. We have in many cases forgotten it was there, but it has not gone anywhere. It is there whenever we insist that laws should be just, whenever we acknowledge that our actions have consequences we cannot escape, whenever we tell stories about going into the darkness and coming back, whenever we grieve well enough to be changed by it, whenever we build something beautiful in a world that will eventually destroy it. The Anunnaki are not in the sky. They are not in outer space. They are in the structure of everything we have ever made. Chapter 17. What the tablets are still trying to tell us. In the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, there is a tablet. It is approximately the size of a paperback book. It is fired clay, tan-colored, covered in the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform script. It was written approximately 4,000 years ago in the ancient city of Nippur by a scribe whose name we do not know, copying from an older text whose original may have been hundreds of years older still. It was excavated from the ruins of Nippur in the 19th century, studied by German and American scholars, partially translated, partially understood, and placed in a case in a museum in a city that has been through war, looting, and devastation since the cuneiform text was first pressed into the clay. The tablet is from the series called Lugale, the great mythological text about the god Ninurta's battle with the demon Anzu and his subsequent organization of the world's geography. It describes Ninurta returning from his victory, bringing back the Tablet of Destinies, and distributing the world's stones. Which ones will be precious? Which ones will be used for tools? Which ones will be ordinary gravel? Which ones will be the material from which temples are built? At one point in the text, Ninurta speaks to the lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone flecked with gold that the Sumerians valued above all other stones, the stone from which the gods' measuring rods were made, the stone that was the color of the sky at night and the deep water. He says, "Lapis lazuli, who in the divine assembly has a status comparable to yours? You are the one who turns the light of the sun god into beauty." The lapis lazuli turns the sun's light into beauty. The sun shines on everything. Lapis lazuli, by its particular nature, takes that light and makes something specific out of it. Beauty, in this text, is not just a quality of things. It is a process of transformation, of a general light being caught and deepened
and concentrated into something that human beings can look at and feel changed by. This is what the Anunnaki mythology does. The universe is full of light, of information, of pattern, of structure, of power. The mythology takes that light and turns it into something human beings can look at and feel changed by. The stories of Enlil and the flood, of Inanna's descent, of Gilgamesh weeping on the shore, of Ningal watching her city burn. These are not just ancient texts, they are lapis lazuli. They are the specific blue stone that catches the light of existence and makes it something you can hold in your hand and look at. What are the tablets still trying to tell us? They are trying to tell us that the universe has structure, not arbitrary structure, not random structure, but structure that is the condition for everything valuable in human experience. The city, the poem, the law, the love, none of these exist without structure. And structure, genuinely understood, includes judgment, includes consequence, includes the principle that what you do cannot be undone, that the dead do not return except under very specific and costly circumstances, that the tablet of destinies is not written in pencil.
They are trying to tell us that wisdom is not the ability to transcend limits. It is the capacity to work brilliantly within them. Enki is the wisest of all beings, not because he has no constraints, but because he understands his constraints better than anyone else and finds the creative space within them. The walls are real. The loopholes are also real. And finding the loophole, the whisper through the wall, the dirt from under the fingernail, the small beings sent to mourn with the queen of the dead, is the highest form of intelligence that the universe rewards. They are trying to tell us that descent is not failure. Going down, losing your attributes, being stripped of everything you rely on to define yourself, this is not the end of the story. It is the middle of the story. The end of the story is what you do after you come back, changed, marked by what you encountered in the deepest dark. They are trying to tell us that grief is a divine gift. The Sumerians believed the art of lamentation was one of the one of the foundational source codes of civilization, not because suffering is desirable, but because the capacity to grieve well, to give loss its full due, to stand in the darkness and name what has been destroyed, is one of the most important capacities a civilization can have. Without it, you cannot process catastrophe. You can only be destroyed by it. They are trying to tell us that justice is more important and more complicated than we usually admit. The Anunnaki's justice is not the justice of wish fulfillment, of the good rewarded and the wicked punished in exactly the proportions we would choose. It is the justice of consequence, of structure, of the cosmos actually caring that things were done and that what was done had a weight that cannot be erased. This is not comfortable, but it is more serious than anything simpler would be. And they are trying to tell us, this is the hardest one, that the beings who govern the structure of reality are not external to us, not aliens from another planet, not robots from a distant civilization, not indifferent administrators of a cosmic bureaucracy. They are, in the deepest sense the mythology can offer, what we become when we look honestly at the universe and ask what is actually there. The Anunnaki are the universe's own nature looked at clearly. They are not comfortable, they are not safe, they are not gentle in the way we might wish, but they are real in the sense that the structures they represent are real. Consequence, judgment, the inescapability of what has been done, the finality of death, the impossibility of lying to the deepest part of reality about who you are. And they are also real in another sense. They made us. Not in the genetic engineering laboratory of the popular mythology, but in the sense that the structure they represent is the structure within which everything human has developed.
We are beings who evolved in a universe that has consequences. We are shaped at the deepest level by the reality of those consequences. Our capacity for love is partly the capacity to know what we could lose. Our capacity for courage is partly the capacity to act despite knowing the consequences. Our capacity for justice is directly, literally, the internalization of the principle the Anunnaki represent, that what you do matters and will be accounted for. The tablets are 4,000 years old. They will outlast us, if we are not careful, for another 4,000 years. They have already outlasted the civilization that wrote them, outlasted the languages in which they were written, outlasted the gods they describe. They sit in their museum cases and wait, in the way that only the oldest things can wait, for someone to pick them up and read them, and come to the same conclusion that every generation of scholars who reads them comes to eventually.
That the people who made these things were paying very close attention to what it was like to be human in a universe governed by forces far larger than any human life, and that they found in those forces not only terror but beauty, not only judgment but the possibility of grace, not only the cold, inexorable structure of consequence, but the warmth of beings who wept when their city burned, who made things from dirt under their fingernails to send to the aid of the lost, who loved the garden they had made even as they allowed it to be flooded. The Anunnaki are not coming back. They never left. They are the structure of the world we live in, as real as gravity and as present as consequence. Every time you make a decision and live with the result, they are present. Every time you tell a story to make sense of suffering, they are present. Every time you build something beautiful in a world that will eventually destroy it, they are present. Every time you go into the dark and come back changed, they are present. They are the ones who made us capable of doing all of that. The least we can do is know their names.
Epilogue. The scribe's colophon. Every important cuneiform tablet ends with a colophon, a note written by the scribe who copied it, identifying themselves, the date of copying, the original source, and sometimes a prayer or a dedication. The colophon served several purposes. It established the tablet's authenticity and its place in the chain of transmission from original to copy. It invoked divine protection for the tablet and its contents, and it identified the human being responsible for the act of preservation, the individual who took the time and care and skill to press the words of the ancestors into fresh clay, to add another link to the chain of transmission. Many colophons end with a standardized formula. May the one who respects this tablet not hand it over to a stranger. May it not be lost. May it stay with its owner. May Nabu, the god of scribes, look upon it with favor. The scribes who copied the Anunnaki myths, the flood stories, the descent of Inanna, the Epic of Gilgamesh, they knew they were preserving something important. They did not know, they could not have imagined that their tablets would outlast their civilization, outlast their language, be excavated from the desert 2,000 years after their burial, be decoded by scholars from cultures their writers had never heard of, be translated into languages that would have been incomprehensible to them, be read by billions of people through technologies that would have looked like magic from any angle. They copied the texts, they pressed the words into clay, they fired the tablets and added them to the library. That was all they could do. It was enough.
The gods they wrote about, Enlil and Enki, Inanna and Ereshkigal, Nergal and Ningal, the 7 unnamed judges of the underworld, the beings who built the structure of the world and maintained it through the long human centuries, did not require our belief to exist in the sense that mattered. They required only that we keep asking the questions their mythology addresses, that we keep telling the stories of descent and return, of flood and survival, of the hero who sought immortality and found something different. that we keep building things that will outlast us, naming the forces that govern our lives, grieving well enough to be changed by loss, finding the loopholes in the walls we cannot break through. The structure they represent, consequence, judgment, the weight of what has been done, the possibility of grace, the inescapability of the deep, is not dependent on our mythology to be real. It is real independent of whether we have a mythology to describe it. The Anunnaki are the names the Sumerians gave to forces that are demonstrably present in the fabric of existence. But names matter. The mythology gave those forces shape. It gave humanity a vocabulary for the most difficult aspects of experience, a narrative framework for catastrophe and grief, and the hunger for immortality, and the strange comfort of knowing that even the gods weep when they destroy what they love. Without the mythology, those experiences exist but cannot be processed. They are just suffering, just loss, just the cold face of a universe that does not explain itself. With the mythology, they become something you can look at, something with structure, something that, if you understand it well enough, might even be navigated. The tablets are there, the 40,000 fragments in their museum cases, the partially reconstructed epics, the exorcism manuals, and the love hymns, and the lamentations, and the king lists with their impossible numbers. They are waiting. The Anunnaki judged Inanna, and she came back. They allowed the flood, and the civilization was rebuilt. They permitted the destruction of Ur, and the scribes survived to write the lament. They are the judges of everything that has ever happened in the human story, and their verdict on that story is not yet final. The verdict is still being written, on clay that does not burn, in words that do not dissolve, by hands that will be dust long before the tablets they shaped. For the scribes of Nippur, whose names we do not know, who pressed the words of the dead into the earth that they might speak to the living. For Enlil, daughter of Sargon, high priestess and first named author in human history, who gave birth to her prayer for Inanna in the worst moment of her life. For the unnamed exorcist, burning his effigy at the midpoint of the night, addressing the great judges of the universe on behalf of someone too sick or too frightened to address them alone. For Gilgamesh on the shore, with nothing. For Ningal watching. For the 7 judges whose names we were never given, who cannot be appeased by offerings, who have never gone anywhere. They are 7. In the depths of the ocean, they are 7. In the brilliance of the heavens, they are 7. From the Maklu Incantation Series, CC 700 BCE. The Anunnaki judged Inanna, and she came back. They allowed the flood, and the civilization was rebuilt. They permitted the destruction of Ur, and the scribes survived to write the lament. They are the judges of everything that has ever happened in the human story, and their verdict on that story is not yet final. The verdict is still being written, on clay that does not burn, in words that do not dissolve, by hands that will be dust long before the tablets they shaped. For the scribes of Nippur, whose names we do not know, who pressed the words of the dead into the earth that they might speak to the living. For Enlil, daughter of Sargon, high priestess and first named author in human history, who gave birth to her prayer for Inanna in the worst moment of her life. For the unnamed exorcist, burning his effigy at the midpoint of the night, addressing the great judges of the universe on behalf of someone too sick or too frightened to address them alone. For Gilgamesh on the shore, with nothing. For Ningal watching. For the 7 judges whose names we were never given, who cannot be appeased by offerings, who have never gone anywhere. They are 7.
In the depths of the ocean, they are 7. In the brilliance of the heavens, they are 7. From the Maklu Incantation series, CC 700 BCE.